Josie Carter pressed her mother's worn leather shoe against her face and screamed. Not a little girl's scream, something older, something that tore itself raw from the center of her chest and kept going long after it should have died. The shoe was still warm from the morning sun. The mud around it was fresh-turned and dark, and Emiline Carter was nowhere. 4 children stood at that creek bank. Josie at 12 holding baby Lily against her ribs with one arm while her fingers locked around that single shoe. Sam at 9, ash-pale and shaking. Violet and Rose behind him, too young to name the thing they were feeling, and old enough to know it was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. Before we go any further into Josie's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me what city you're watching from today. Because what happens next in that canyon will change every single one of these lives forever. The shoe was a size 7 brown leather. The sole, worn thin at the heel, the way it always got from Emiline's habit of dragging her right foot just slightly when she walked tired. Josie knew that shoe the way she knew her own hands. She had watched her mother lace it up 1,000 mornings in 1,000 different circumstances. In the cold dark of a Kansas farmhouse at 4 in the morning. In the back of a wagon with her knees pulled to her chest. In the weeds outside Tucson when the wagon wheel broke and they had to sleep in the open for 3 nights. She knew that shoe. She knew her mother would not have taken it off. Not here, not at a creek crossing in the middle of open Colorado hill country, with 4 of her children depending on her to keep moving. Emiline Carter did not stop moving. That was the one law of their lives that had never broken until now. Josie. Sam's voice came out pressed flat, like he was trying to keep it from shaking apart. Josie, where is she? I don't know. You said you'd only be gone 10 minutes to fill the canteens. I know what I said, Sam. You left us back there with the girls, and you said 10 minutes. And now Mama's. I know. Josie turned on him so fast that Rose flinched and pressed herself against Sam's side. I know. I was gone 10 minutes. I came back and she isn't here, Sam. The shoe is here and she isn't. And I need you to stop talking and help me think. Sam pressed his mouth into a line. He was 9 years old, and he had the face of a boy who had already decided he was not going to cry no matter what. That was the thing about Sam. He stored everything in that jaw, locked it down like a chest with a bad hinge, and just kept standing. Josie had always been grateful for that. She was grateful for it now, even as it terrified her. Baby Lily made a sound against Josie's collarbone, not quite a cry, more of a shudder, like she was cold, even in the full blaze of the July sun. Josie shifted her, pressed her palm flat against the back of Lily's head, and felt it. The heat. Too much heat coming off the baby's skull. Lily was 8 months old. She had been fussy and warm since the morning before, and Emiline had been watching her with that particular quiet expression she wore when she was frightened but refusing to show it. She's burning up again, Josie said, mostly to herself. Mama had the fever drops in her coat pocket, Violet offered. She was 7, and she said it with a 7-year-old's confidence that this information would fix something. I know she did. Josie turned to look downstream, then up. The creek bent hard to the right, about 30 yards above them, and disappeared around a wall of red rock. She could not see what was past that bend. She could not see anything past that bend. The mud on the bank was churned in a way that made her stomach go cold. Boot prints that weren't her mother's. Wider, heavier, the kind left by men. Sam. She kept her voice steady. She had been keeping her voice steady for 3 weeks now, and she was so tired of it, she could have sat down in the creek and just let the current carry her somewhere. I need you to take Violet and Rose back to the tree line. The big cottonwood where we left the packs. You remember it? Yeah, stay there. Keep the girls low. Don't make noise. Where are you going? Up the bank. I need to see what's past that bend. Sam grabbed her arm. His grip was harder than she expected for a 9-year-old, hard enough that she actually stopped. You are not going up there alone, he said. His voice did not shake. It was a statement of plain fact. Someone has to stay with Violet and Rose. Then you stay with them and I'll go. Sam, you've got Lily. She opened her mouth, closed it. He was right. She was holding a sick infant against her chest with one arm and her mother's shoe in her other hand, and she was in no position to argue about who was better positioned to scout a creek bend in hill country in the middle of a Colorado July. She hated that he was right. She hated that he was 9 years old and right about something that no 9-year-old should ever have to be right about. "You go to the bend," she said. "You look around it. You don't step past the rock, you just look. And if you see anything, anyone, you come straight back. You do not engage with anyone. You do not speak to anyone. You come straight back to me. Say it back. I go to the bend. I look around the rock. I see anyone. I come back. Anyone? Anyone." He met her eyes. "I'll be 2 minutes." He was back in 90 seconds. "There's men up there," he said. He was breathing hard, but his voice was still flat and controlled. And Josie thought, not for the first time, that Sam was going to be either a very great man or a very dangerous one when he grew up. "Two of them that I can see. They've got horses and they've got—" He stopped. "Sam, they've got Mama." The world did a slow, tilting thing. Josie felt it physically. A drop in her chest, a ringing in her ears. The sun suddenly too bright on every surface. Baby Lily whimpered and pressed her hot face into Josie's neck. Rose started to cry with the quiet, miserable efficiency of a 5-year-old who had learned that crying loudly got her in trouble. Violet reached over and took Rose's hand without being asked. "She's alive." Josie's voice came out barely above a whisper. She was standing. They had her hands tied. Sam's jaw worked. She wasn't fighting them. She looked like she was trying to be calm, like she was trying to think. That was Emiline Carter all over, trying to think. Even with her hands bound and her children somewhere behind her in a canyon, she was standing there trying to think, because she knew that panic was the most expensive thing a person could spend in a bad situation, and she could not afford it. "Okay," Josie said. Her voice was still shaking, but her mind had gone very clear the way it always did when things got worse. This was the gift her mother had never intended to give her, the terrible ability to function in a crisis. "We need help. I can't go up there with Lily, and you can't go up there at 9 years old. And if those men see us, they'll—" She stopped herself before she finished that sentence. "Not in front of Violet and Rose. We need an adult." "There are no adults," Sam said. It was not accusatory, it was simply the truth. "Then we find one." She had not planned to say it. It came out of some part of her that had been running calculations in the background, while the rest of her was crumbling. They were in Colorado hill country, maybe 8 miles from the nearest settlement. And the settlement was small, a cluster of ranches and a feed store and a church she had seen from the ridge 2 days prior. If someone was out working their land today, if someone was close enough to the canyon edge to hear, she tipped her head back and she screamed. Not a word, not a name, just sound. The biggest sound she had in her. Everything from the bottom of her lungs up through her throat and out into the open summer air. It bounced off the red rock walls and rolled across the canyon, and she felt it in her ribs when it came back to her. Baby Lily startled and began to cry in earnest now, and Rose cried harder in sympathy, and the whole creek bank was suddenly a wall of noise. Sam stared at her. "What are you doing?" "Getting help. You're going to get those men's attention. They already know we're somewhere in this canyon. Mama being here tells them that." She hauled air into her lungs. "If there's a person within a mile of this place, they'll hear us." She screamed again. And then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not from the direction of the bend, from above, from the ridge. Silas Turner had not intended to come down into that canyon today. He had intended to ride his north fence line, check the 3 posts he'd been meaning to fix since March, and be back to his ranch by noon. That was the plan. He was good at plans when they involved the ranch and the horses and the land and nothing else. He was considerably less good at anything that involved other people, which was why he had spent the better part of 4 years ensuring that he had as few encounters with other people as humanly possible. He heard the scream when he was on the ridge above the creek, and his horse threw her head and sidestepped. He pulled her in without thinking, listening. It came again. Longer this time, roar, the kind of sound that did not come from an animal, and did not come from a person who was merely startled. It came from someone who was afraid, in the particular bottomless way of a person who had run out of options. He sat there for a moment that felt longer than it was. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself it was probably a couple of travelers having a disagreement, or a woman who'd seen a snake, or any number of things that were none of his business and did not require him to descend a steep canyon wall and involve himself in someone else's disaster. Then he heard the baby. He did not choose to move. His hands found his reins, and his heels found his mare's sides, and she picked her way down the canyon slope before he had consciously decided to let her. What he found at the bottom of that creek bank was not what he had expected. He had expected, if he was honest, one person. He had not expected 4 children, the oldest no more than 12, standing in the creek mud with a baby on her hip and a worn leather shoe clutched in her fist. Her face set into an expression of fierce, exhausted authority that had absolutely no business being on a child's face. 3 others stood slightly behind her. A boy with close-cropped dark hair and the defensive posture of someone who had appointed himself bodyguard. 2 small girls, one of them openly weeping, and one of them watching Silas with enormous, unblinking gray eyes that felt like they were counting his sins. Silas pulled his mare to a halt 15 feet away and said nothing. He had learned over 4 years of near-total solitude that silence was generally the right first move. People filled silence. They told you things in silence that they would never tell you if you spoke first. The oldest girl spoke first. "Are you from one of the ranches up on the ridge?" "I am," he said. "How many men are on your land?" He blinked. That was not the question he had anticipated. "It's just me. Do you have a gun?" He did. He had the Colt revolver on his right hip that he wore out of habit more than expectation, and the Winchester in the saddle scabbard which he carried because this was Colorado hill country, and there were mountain lions and the occasional dispute over property lines that could go sideways without warning. "I do," he said. "My mother has been taken by 2 men with horses. They're up the creek around that bend in the rock. They have her hands bound." The girl said it the way someone reads from a list, deliberately, each word placed precisely, like she had already organized the information into what a person needed to know first. "I need your help getting her back." Silas looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the baby on her hip, whose face was flushed with what was clearly a fever. He looked at the boy who was watching him with open suspicion. He looked at the 2 small girls, one crying and one not. He looked at the shoe in the oldest girl's hand. "What's your name?" he said. "Josie Carter. That's Sam and Violet and Rose, and the baby is Lily. Where are you coming from, Josie Carter?" She paused. Something flickered behind her eyes. A decision about how much to tell him. "Kansas, originally. We've been traveling." She paused again. "We've been running, actually, from some men. I think these are the same men. What do these men want with your family?" Her chin came up. She was 12 years old, and she had the dignity of someone considerably older. "They want my mother," she said, "and I intend to get her back. I'm asking for your help because I have 4 children in this canyon and a baby who needs medicine, and I cannot be in 2 places at once. If you won't help me, then I need you to take the children to your ranch and keep them safe while I go get her myself." Sam made a sound of protest at that. Silas ignored it. He sat on his horse, and he looked at this child who had apparently decided that those were her only 2 options. Get help or do it alone. And he felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Not pity. Something harder and less comfortable than pity. Recognition. He had been alone in a bad place once. He had been the one with no options and no one coming. He knew what that felt like from the inside. And he had sworn to himself after it that he would never be the person who didn't come when someone needed coming to. "I'll help you," he said. The boy Sam took a step forward. "We don't know you." "No," Silas agreed. "You don't. You could be one of them. You could be with the men who took Mama." "I could be." Silas swung down from the saddle. The mare shifted but stayed put. He stood at his full height, which was considerable, and he looked at the boy straight on because Sam was the kind of boy who would respect being looked at straight on and would not respect anything less. "I'm not. But I understand that you don't have a reason to take my word for that." "No, we don't," Sam said. "Then let me earn it." He looked at Josie. "The baby needs water and shade first. How long has she been running that fever?" Josie blinked. The question had surprised her. "Since yesterday morning, Mama had fever drops, but they were in her coat pocket. I don't have fever drops. I've got willow bark at the ranch. He glanced at the creek. Creek water's clean this high up. Get her drinking. Then I need to know everything you know about those men. How many horses, what they were wearing, whether they're armed, and how. You're going to help us? Rose asked. She had stopped crying and was looking up at him with the sudden, absolute trust of a 5-year-old who has been frightened for a long time and wants very badly to believe that an adult has arrived to fix things. It was the most dangerous look Silas Turner had ever seen, because it was the kind of look that made a man feel the weight of what he was agreeing to. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he meant it. "I'm going to help you." "Why?" Sam asked. It was the right question. Silas considered it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to consider anything these days. He thought about the fence posts that still needed fixing. He thought about the 4 years he had spent telling himself that his business was his land and his horses, and nothing beyond the edge of his property. He thought about the leather shoe in Josie's hand and the way she had been holding it against her chest when he rode up, like it was the last thing she had of her mother, which maybe it was, because there isn't anyone else, he said. Sam held his gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then slowly he stepped back. Not all the way, not with any warmth, but back, which was enough. Josie was already kneeling at the creek bank, cupping water to Lily's lips with one careful hand, murmuring things to the baby in a low voice that was too quiet for Silas to hear. Violet had taken Rose's hand again. The whole scene had the quality of a family that had been practicing this, moving through hardship together, each person finding their role, closing ranks around the weakest member without being told. Silas led his mare to the water and let her drink. And he watched the Carter children, and he thought about the men around that bend in the rock. And he thought about what kind of men took a woman with 4 children in a canyon in July. And he thought about the fact that he had a revolver and a Winchester, and the advantage of knowing this particular stretch of hill country better than anyone else alive. "Tell me everything," he said to Josie. She looked up from the baby. Her eyes were dry. She had screamed herself empty 20 minutes ago, and now she was back to the business of surviving. And she began to talk. Silas Turner listened to every word. She talked for 7 minutes straight without stopping. She told Silas about the farm outside of Dodge City that had belonged to her father before he died of pneumonia 2 winters back. She told him about the debt, a loan her father had taken from a man named Emmett Crane, a man who ran cattle north of the Arkansas River, and who had a way of making loans that were designed from the start never to be repaid in full. She told him how Crane had started coming to the farm after the funeral, first with papers, then with men, then with a kind of pressure that didn't use fists because it didn't need to. She told him about the morning 3 weeks ago when her mother had packed 5 children into a wagon before dawn and driven west without a word to anyone, and how she had said only one thing the entire first day of travel: "We are not going back." Silas listened without moving. His eyes stayed on Josie's face, then moved occasionally to the bend in the creek, then back. He had the quality of a man who could be completely still, which Josie found both reassuring and unsettling, because she could not tell what he was thinking behind that stillness. "Emmett Crane," he said when she finished. "You know him." He was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. "I know of him," he said. "Then you know what kind of man he is." "I know what kind of man he is," Silas agreed. Sam had come closer during Josie's telling. He was standing about 4 feet off Silas's left shoulder now, arms crossed, his posture radiating the particular brand of watchful hostility that Sam had apparently been born with and had been refining ever since. "If you know about Crane," he said, "then you know that those men around that bend aren't regular hired hands. They're not going to walk away because a rancher asks them to." "No," Silas said, "they won't. So what's the plan?" Silas looked at him. "You got a lot of nerve for a 9-year-old. My mama is tied up around that rock," Sam said. "I don't have time for anything but nerve." Something shifted in Silas's expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement, like a man recognizing something he'd seen before in a mirror. He turned back to Josie. "How many men did you see?" Sam saw 2. "Crane doesn't travel with 2. "No," Silas said, "he doesn't. He moved to his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen, which he handed to Josie without comment. She took it and got more water into Lily, who drank with the desperate gulping urgency of a sick baby who hadn't had enough fluid since morning. Silas watched the infant for a moment, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She needs that willow bark. I've got it at the ranch." "Your ranch is how far?" 2 miles north, but we're not going to the ranch yet." Josie looked up sharply. "If Crane has your mother, and he knows you children are loose in this canyon," Silas said, "then the moment he figures out which direction you ran, he'll send men after you. 2 miles is not far enough to outrun a man on horseback if he already knows which way to look." "So we need to get Mama first," Josie said. "We need to know what we're walking into first," Silas said, "which means I need to get eyes around that bend before we move anyone." "I already looked," Sam said. "You looked from the outside of the rock. I need to look from the inside." He turned to Josie. "Can you keep Lily quiet for 20 minutes? Josie looked at her baby sister. Lily's eyes were glassy and half-lidded, her mouth working in that slow, distressed way that meant she was too exhausted even to cry properly. It was the kind of quiet that was worse than crying. "I'll keep her quiet," Josie said. "Stay at the tree line. Don't move until I come back." He looked at Sam. "That includes you." Sam's jaw set. "And if you don't come back?" It was the question an adult would ask. A sensible, strategic adult who was thinking 2 steps ahead and accounting for every possibility. Silas looked at this 9-year-old boy and felt the weight of it, the strange and awful competence that hard circumstances manufactured in children who should have been worried about nothing more serious than the summer harvest. "If I'm not back in 20 minutes, Silas said, "you take your sisters and the baby, and you head north along the canyon wall. Stay off the open ground. There's a ranch house at the base of the ridge, red roof. You'll see it from the high ground. Tell whoever's there that Silas Turner sent you. Can you do that?" "Silas Turner," Sam repeated, committing it. "That's right. And our mama?" The question sat between them. Silas did not look away from it. 20 minutes, he said. "I'll be back in 20. He was back in 14. Josie knew from the set of his shoulders before he even reached them that what he had seen was not good. He moved fast, faster than he had gone in, and he went straight to his saddlebag and pulled out the Winchester without preamble and checked the load with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done it enough times that his hands didn't require his brain's participation. "How many?" Josie said. 4 men. 2 I could see originally, 2 more with the horses farther back. He looked at her. "Your mother is on her feet. She's not hurt." The relief hit Josie so hard her knees actually buckled, and she caught herself on the mare's flank. She pressed her free hand to her mouth for exactly 2 seconds, then straightened. "Okay," she said. "Okay. There's something else." She looked at him. The man giving orders up there, the one with the gray coat and the silver band on his hat. He paused. "That's not hired help. Who is it?" Silas met her eyes. "That's Emmett Crane himself." The name landed like a stone in still water and sent ripples through all of them. Rose whimpered. Sam went very white and then very still in the particular way that meant he was furious and controlling it. Josie's hand tightened around the canteen until her knuckles ached. "He followed us," she said. It came out like a statement, but it was really the moment she understood something she had been trying not to understand for 3 weeks. That they had not been running fast enough. That Crane had not been following at a distance out of convenience, but had been tracking them with patience and intention. That the whole journey west had not been an escape so much as a slow narrowing of the trap. "He's not here by coincidence," Silas said. "A man like Crane doesn't ride into Colorado Hill Country himself unless what he's after is worth riding for personally." "Why would he?" Josie stopped. Her eyes cut to Sam, and Sam looked back at her, and something passed between them that Silas could see but not read. "What does he want with Mama?" she asked. But the way she asked it told Silas she already had a theory and didn't like it. "That's what I intend to find out," he said. "But right now, I need you to listen to me very carefully, because we don't have time for anything but the right decisions." He crouched down so he was at Violet and Rose's eye level, a gesture that surprised Josie because it was not the gesture of a man who was in the habit of crouching for children. "You two," he said. His voice went different, not softer exactly, but stripped of its urgency, made plain and calm the way you'd speak to a spooked horse. "What are your names again?" "Violet," said Violet, who had stopped crying and was back to watching him with those enormous gray eyes. "Rose," said Rose in a voice barely above a breath. "Violet and Rose," he said. "I'm going to need you to be the bravest you've ever been today. Can you do that for your mama?" Rose looked at Violet. Violet looked at Rose. Some wordless negotiation occurred. "Yes, sir," Violet said for both of them. He stood up. He looked at Josie. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, and he told her the plan in the clear, organized way of a man who had thought it through completely in the 14 minutes he had been gone. He would go back around the bend, but not the way he'd come. He knew a cut in the rock wall above the creek that came out on a ledge overlooking the far side of the bend. He'd used it twice, once for a runaway steer and once for reasons he did not explain. From there, he could get eyes directly down on Crane's position and get a clear read on the situation before he made any move. What he needed from Josie was a distraction, not a dangerous one, not one that put her in any man's reach. Just sound from this side of the bend, enough to pull attention in the wrong direction for 30 seconds. "I can do that," Josie said. "I know you can." He said it with the simple directness of a man making a plain observation, and Josie felt it land somewhere in her chest that had been hollow for weeks. The strange, unexpected comfort of being believed in by someone who didn't have to. "What happens if things go wrong?" Sam asked. "Define wrong. What if there are more than 4 men? What if they—" Sam paused. "What if they hurt her before you can get to her?" Silas looked at him for a long moment. He did not offer a false reassurance. Josie appreciated that in the way you could appreciate a hard thing for being honest. "Then I'll do what needs to be done with a different set of circumstances," he said. "But I've been in worse situations than 4 men and a canyon, and I'm still here." Sam considered this. "Why do you know how to do this?" he asked. "You're a rancher." "I wasn't always a rancher." Sam's eyes narrowed. "What were you before?" "Someone who learned things it would have been better not to need to know." He picked up the Winchester and looked at Josie. 10 minutes. Stay put until you hear my signal." "What's your signal?" "You'll know it," he said, and moved. He was right. She knew it. 8 minutes later, a sharp whistle came from above the rock wall. 2 short notes and 1 long, and Josie drew breath and made the biggest noise she could, which turned out to be her brother's name, screamed at the top of her lungs with a raw, ragged edge that required no acting whatsoever, because it came from the same place as the scream she'd made at the creek bank. Pure fear, pure desperation, the sound of a child who had run out of everything. "Sam! Sam, help me!" She heard movement from around the bend. Boots on rock, voices low and fast, men orienting toward her. She pressed herself back against the canyon wall with Lily clutched to her chest, one hand over the baby's mouth as gently as she could manage, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Then came the sound of a scuffle, something heavy hitting rock. A man's voice raised in shock rather than aggression. A single sharp command in Silas's voice that Josie couldn't make out but felt in her bones as authority. And then silence. Then, "Josie Carter," Silas's voice, clear and controlled, coming from around the bend. "You can come now." She moved before she consciously decided to. Sam caught her arm. "Wait," he said. His voice was tight. "We don't know what's—" "That's him," Josie said. "You've known him 40 minutes. "I know his voice," she said again, and she pulled free. She came around the bend and stopped. 2 of Crane's men were on the ground, not dead. She could see one of them moving, and the other 2 were backed against the far rock wall with their hands up and expressions that suggested they had severely miscalculated what they were walking into when they'd followed a wagon trail west from Kansas. Silas stood with the Winchester and an expression that was not angry exactly, but entirely without mercy. And there, off to the left, with her wrists still bound in front of her and a cut on her chin that made Josie's stomach turn over, was Emiline Carter. Josie ran. Lily cried out as she jostled, and Josie was saying, "Mama, Mama, Mama," before she even reached her, the word coming out in that broken, helpless way it came out of children when they had been holding everything together for far too long, and had finally reached the one person in the world they were holding it together for. Emiline caught her with her bound hands and pulled her in, arms up and over Josie's head, and she said, "I've got you, baby. I've got you." In the voice that Josie had been hearing in her head for 3 weeks as the voice of something she might never get back. "Mama." Josie was crying now, all the way, crying and not trying to stop it. "I found your shoe. I found your shoe. And I thought, I know." Emiline was shaking. She was trying to hide it, but Josie could feel it. "I know you did. You did exactly right." Lily reached out one small fist from between them and grabbed Emiline's sleeve with the blind, certain grip of an infant who has found what it was looking for. And Emiline made a sound that was not quite a word, just a sound. The sound of a mother feeling her baby's weight again after believing she might not. Silas said without turning, "Can someone cut these ropes?" Sam was already there, his pocket knife out, working at the knot with practiced hands. He didn't say anything to his mother. He just worked at the rope until it gave. And when Emiline's hands came free, Sam pressed his face against her side for exactly 3 seconds, and then stepped back and folded his knife closed and looked anywhere but at the other people present. The 2 men against the wall hadn't moved. One of the men on the ground had stopped moving altogether. Silas kept his eyes on all of them, with the even, watchful attention of a man who knew that the most dangerous moment was the one right after the crisis, when everyone assumed the danger was over. Because Emmett Crane was not here. Josie looked around the space. 4 men, horses, her mother, and the absence of one specific gray coat and one specific silver-banded hat that Silas had described with his own eyes not 20 minutes ago. "Where is he?" she asked. Silas's jaw tightened. "He was here when I came over the ridge. He's gone now. He ran." "Emmett Crane doesn't run," Silas said, and his voice carried something in it that made everyone in earshot go very still. "He repositions." He turned and looked at Josie, and his eyes held the one thing she had not yet seen in them, the thing she had not expected from a man this controlled and certain. He looked at her, and she saw that he was worried. "We need to move," he said, "right now, all of us." They moved. Not in a line, not in formation, but in the tight, desperate cluster of people who have just survived something and know the next thing is coming. Silas took point, his Winchester still in hand, his eyes cutting left and right along the canyon walls. Emiline followed, with Rose pressed against her side and Violet's hand clamped in her own. Sam walked backward for the first 30 yards, watching the bend where Crane had disappeared, his jaw set and his fists clenched at his sides. Josie brought up the rear with Lily, the baby's breathing shallow and quick against her neck, the heat of the fever radiating through the thin cotton of her dress. The canyon opened onto a wide, sloping bench of sage and juniper, and beyond that, the land rose in a series of low ridges toward the north. Silas did not take the obvious path. He angled east toward a cut between 2 rock outcroppings that looked like nothing but shadow from a distance, but up close revealed a narrow game trail winding upward through the scrub. He moved with the economy of a man who had crossed this ground 100 times, never wasting a step, never pausing to orient himself. The children followed without question, because there was no time for questions, and because something in the way Silas moved told them he knew exactly where he was going. They climbed for what felt like an hour, but was probably no more than 20 minutes. The sun beat down from a sky so pale it looked bleached, and the dust rose in fine clouds around their boots, coating their throats and settling in the creases of their clothes. Lily began to cry, a thin, reedy sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Josie shifted her, bounced her gently, murmured the lullaby their mother had always sung, the one about the river and the cottonwood tree. Lily's cries subsided to hiccups, then to silence, but the silence was worse because it meant the baby was too weak to keep fighting. Emiline turned, her eyes finding Josie's, and something passed between them, the knowledge that they were running out of time for the baby as well as for themselves. Silas stopped at the top of the ridge. He stood there for a long moment, scanning the horizon, his body still except for the slight turn of his head as he checked each quadrant of the landscape. Then he looked back at them and pointed. Down below, maybe half a mile distant, a cluster of buildings sat in a shallow valley. A house, a barn, a corral, a windmill turning slowly in the afternoon breeze. The roof was red, just as he had said. The yard was fenced with peeled poles. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, though the day was hot enough that no fire should have been necessary. "That's my place," he said. "We'll be there in 10 minutes. They made it in 12. The last stretch was downhill, and the children's legs were trembling with exhaustion by the time they reached the yard. Sam stopped at the gate and looked at the house with the same measuring suspicion he had applied to everything since the creek bank. "It's small," he said. "It's enough," Silas replied. He swung open the gate and held it for them, and Emiline led the children through with a murmured word of thanks that caught in her throat. The inside of the house was dim and cool after the glare of the open range. The front room was sparsely furnished. A wooden table with 4 chairs, a settle against the far wall, a cast-iron stove in the corner, a few shelves with tin plates and cups. There were no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floor, nothing that spoke of a life lived with others. But the floor was swept clean, and the dishes were stacked in neat rows, and the air smelled of cedar and dust, and the faint, lingering trace of coffee. Josie stood in the middle of the room and looked around. There was a door to the left, slightly ajar, and through the crack she could see the edge of a bed frame and a folded blanket. A bedroom. One bedroom. For a man who had lived alone for 4 years, that made sense. For a family of 6, it made a different kind of sense, one that she did not yet know how to measure. "Put the baby on the bed," Silas said. He was already moving to the stove, lifting the lid and feeding kindling into the cold ash. "I'll get the willow bark." Emiline disappeared through the bedroom door with Lily, and Josie heard the soft creak of the bed frame and her mother's voice, low and steady, singing the same lullaby Josie had tried to sing on the ridge. She stood in the doorway and watched as Emiline laid Lily on the worn quilt and began to unbutton the baby's dress, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had undressed a feverish child 100 times before. But her hands were shaking, just a little, just enough for Josie to see. "I need water," Emiline said without looking up. "Hot water if you can manage it." Josie turned and found Silas already at the pump outside the back door, filling a kettle. He brought it in and set it on the stove without a word, then crossed to a cupboard and pulled out a small cloth sack. He untied the drawstring and extracted a handful of dried bark, the color of pale wood, and laid it on the table. "Steep it for 10 minutes," he said. "Then strain it and give it to her in spoonfuls. Not too fast, or she'll bring it back up." Emiline appeared in the doorway. She looked at the bark, then at Silas, and something in her expression shifted. The tight, guarded line of her mouth softened, just a fraction, just enough. "Thank you," she said. It was a simple word, but the weight behind it filled the room. Silas nodded once and stepped back, giving her space at the stove. He went to the front window and stood there, looking out at the yard, his back to the room. It was a deliberate gesture, Josie realized. He was giving them privacy, giving them room to breathe, without making a production of it. She had never seen a man do that before. Her father had been a good man, but he had filled a room when he entered it, his presence a constant pressure, his love loud and demanding. Silas was different. He occupied space without claiming it. He was there, but he did not ask for anything in return. Sam had not come inside. Josie found him on the front porch, sitting on the top step with his elbows on his knees and his eyes fixed on the ridge they had just descended. He did not look at her when she sat down beside him. "He's not coming," Sam said. "Who?" "Crane." Sam's voice was flat, but there was a tremor underneath it, the vibration of a string pulled too tight. "He's not coming because he doesn't have to. He knows where we are. He knows we can't run much farther. He'll just wait." Josie considered this. She wanted to argue, to offer some reassurance, but she had learned something in the past 3 weeks that she had not known before. She had learned that false comfort was a kind of cruelty, that telling someone everything would be fine when you did not know if it would be fine was a way of abandoning them to face the truth alone. "Maybe," she said, "but maybe he doesn't know about Silas." Sam turned to look at her. His eyes were red-rimmed, though he had not cried. He had not cried at the creek, had not cried when he saw their mother bound, had not cried when they crossed the ridge. He stored everything in that jaw, locked it down, and just kept standing. "What's to know?" he said. "He's a rancher. He's one man." "He took out 4 of Crane's men," Josie said. "He had the element of surprise, and a rifle. He came down into that canyon when he didn't have to. He didn't know us. He didn't owe us anything. He came anyway." Sam looked back at the ridge. The sun was lower now, the shadows lengthening across the valley floor. A hawk circled high above, riding a thermal in slow, patient loops. "People do things for reasons," he said. "We don't know his reasons." "No," Josie agreed. "We don't. But we know what he did, and right now that's enough." Sam said nothing, but he did not argue, and that was something. Inside, the kettle began to whistle. Emiline steeped the willow bark in a tin cup, let it cool, and carried it to the bedroom. Josie followed and watched as her mother lifted Lily's head and held the cup to her lips. The baby drank, a little at first, then more, her small throat working with each swallow. When the cup was empty, Emiline lowered her back to the pillow and smoothed the hair from her forehead. Her color was still too pale, her skin still too warm, but the tightness around her mouth had eased, and her breathing had slowed to something almost normal. "She'll sleep now," Emiline said. "The bark will bring the fever down. It'll take a few hours, but she'll be all right." She said it with a certainty that Josie wanted to believe, and mostly did. Because if Emiline Carter said something would be all right, it usually was. That was the law of their lives. The same law that said their mother did not stop moving, and Josie had seen that law bend today, but she had not seen it break. The afternoon passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Violet and Rose explored the yard, finding a patch of dandelions and a broken wagon wheel that became, in their imaginations, a castle and a ship, and a dozen other things that needed no translation. Sam disappeared into the barn and emerged 20 minutes later with the information that there were 2 horses, a milk cow, and a surprising number of chickens for a man who lived alone. He delivered this report to Silas with the gravity of a junior officer reporting to a superior, and Silas received it with the same gravity, as if the inventory of his own livestock was news to him. "The chickens are a recent development," Silas said. "They showed up last spring. I think they belonged to someone else, but they decided to stay." Sam considered this. "They're not branded," he said. "No," Silas agreed. "They're not. So they're yours now." "I suppose they are." Sam nodded, satisfied with the legal reasoning, and went back to the barn. Josie watched this exchange from the porch, and she saw something she had not expected to see. She saw Sam's shoulders drop, just a fraction, just enough. He had been holding himself so tight for so long that she had forgotten what relaxation looked like on him. It looked like a 9-year-old boy examining chickens as if they were the most interesting thing in the world, because for a moment they were the only thing he had to worry about. Supper was simple. Bread that Emiline had found in Silas's cupboard, hard but edible. Beans that she had coaxed into submission with salt and patience. Coffee, strong and black, that Silas made without being asked. They ate at the table, all 6 of them plus Silas, and for a few minutes the only sounds were the clink of spoons and the soft murmur of Violet telling Rose something about the dandelions. Then Rose looked up and said, "Is this our house now?" The question hung in the air. Emiline set down her spoon. She looked at Silas, and Silas looked at her, and there was a silence that lasted exactly as long as it took for something to pass between them, something unspoken and unbreakable. "This is Mr. Turner's house," Emiline said. "We are his guests." "But we're staying," Rose said. It was not a question. Emiline looked at Silas again. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and something in Emiline's face relaxed. "Yes," she said, "we're staying, for now." Rose accepted this with the same absolute certainty she had applied to everything since the canyon. She picked up her spoon and went back to her beans, and the conversation moved on. After supper, Emiline washed the dishes while Sam and Josie dried them. Violet and Rose were put to bed on the settle, wrapped in a blanket that Silas produced from a chest in the corner, and they were asleep before the sun had fully set. Lily had not stirred since the willow bark, and when Emiline checked her, the fever had dropped enough that her skin felt merely warm instead of scorching. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched her youngest daughter breathe, and Josie stood in the doorway and watched her mother, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. Later, when the stars were out, and the house had settled into the quiet rhythm of sleeping children, Silas went outside and sat on the porch steps. Josie found him there, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat down beside him. Not too close, not so far that it looked like she was avoiding him. Somewhere in between, where she could see his face in the moonlight. "You're not going to sleep?" he asked. "I'm not tired." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else. "You've been through more today than most people see in a year. You should be exhausted." "I am," she admitted, "but I can't sleep until I know." "Know what?" "That we're safe. That Crane isn't coming tonight." Silas looked out at the dark valley. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry grass beyond the yard, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. He did not answer for a long time, and when he did, his voice was quiet and careful. "I can't tell you that you're safe," he said. "I can tell you that I'll do everything in my power to keep you that way. And I can tell you that I've been in worse spots than this and come out the other side. But I won't lie to you, Josie. Crane is still out there, and he's not the kind of man who gives up because he lost one round." Josie nodded. She had known that. She had known it since she saw the empty space where Crane should have been, since she watched him slip away while Silas was dealing with his men. He would come back. The only question was when. "How did you know how to do that?" she asked. "In the canyon, how did you know where to stand, how to move, how to get the drop on them?" Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was a scout for the army, before I came here. I spent 5 years riding ahead of cavalry columns, reading sign, finding the places where trouble liked to hide. I learned how to see a situation before it happened, how to be where the other man wasn't looking." "Why did you stop?" He did not answer immediately. The wind picked up again, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called, a high, thin yip that faded into the darkness. When he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "I had a wife," he said. "And a daughter. They died while I was away on a patrol. Cholera. By the time I got back, they were already buried. I stayed with the army for another year, but I couldn't." He stopped, and Josie saw his jaw tighten in the moonlight. "I couldn't be around people after that. So I came here. I bought this land with what I had saved, and I built this house, and I told myself that this was enough." Josie sat with this information. It settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples outward. She had known there was a story behind his silence. She had not known it would match her own family's story so closely. Loss. Running. The attempt to build something new out of the wreckage of what had been. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her, and in the dim light she saw something move across his face, something raw and unguarded that he had not intended to show. "So am I," he said. They sat in silence for a while longer. The coyote called again, farther away this time. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath them. But Josie did not feel small. She felt, for the first time in weeks, as if she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I think you should sleep," Silas said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "What's happening tomorrow?" "We'll figure that out when the sun comes up, but you'll need your strength." Josie nodded and stood. She paused at the door and looked back at him, still sitting on the steps, his silhouette outlined against the stars. "Mr. Turner," she said. "Silas, thank you for coming down into that canyon." He did not turn around, but his voice carried back to her, quiet and sure. "You would have done the same for me." She thought about that as she walked back inside. She thought about whether she would have done the same for a stranger, and she wanted to believe that she would have. But she knew, with the hard, unblinking honesty that had kept her alive for the past 3 weeks, that she could not be certain. That kind of certainty was a luxury she had never been able to afford. But she wanted to learn it. She wanted to become the kind of person who would ride down into a canyon for someone she did not know, because it was the right thing to do. She lay down beside Violet and Rose on the settle, pulling a corner of the blanket over her shoulders. The house was quiet, but not silent. She could hear the creak of the floorboards as Emiline moved in the bedroom, the soft murmur of her voice as she checked on Lily. She could hear Sam's breathing from the corner where he had spread a blanket on the floor, the steady rhythm of a boy who had finally let himself sleep. And outside, she could hear the faint, steady footsteps of Silas Turner, walking the perimeter of his property, watching the dark, making sure that nothing came for them in the night. She closed her eyes. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know if Crane would return, or if the law would find him, or if they would ever be truly safe. But she knew one thing. She knew that she was not alone. And for now, that was enough. She was on the edge of sleep when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it, buried under the whisper of the wind and the creak of the house. It came from somewhere outside, somewhere beyond the yard, a single, distant note that was not an animal and not the wind. A horse, whinnying, and then another. Josie's eyes snapped open. She lay still, listening, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. The horses in the barn were quiet. She had checked them herself before supper, had seen them standing in their stalls, drowsy and content. What she was hearing came from farther away, from the ridge. She rose without waking the others and crossed to the front window. The yard was empty. The gate was closed. The moon hung low over the valley, casting long shadows across the ground. She could see nothing moving, nothing out of place. But the horses were still calling, and their voices were growing closer. She found Silas at the side of the house, standing in the shadow of the rain barrel, his Winchester in his hand. He did not turn when she approached, but she saw his shoulders tighten as she came near. "They're coming," she whispered. "I know. How many?" He was quiet for a moment, listening. Then he said, "At least 3, maybe more." She stood beside him, staring into the darkness, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind carried the sound of hoofbeats now, faint but unmistakable, the rhythm of horses moving at a trot across hard ground. "Go inside," he said. "Wake your mother. Keep the children in the back room, and don't come out until I tell you." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that she was not a child who needed to be hidden away, that she had held her family together for 3 weeks, and she could hold them together now. But she saw the look in his eyes, and she knew that this was not about her. This was about him doing what he had to do, what he had been trained to do, what he needed to do to keep them safe. She went inside. She woke Emiline with a hand on her shoulder, and she told her what she had heard. Emiline was on her feet in an instant, her face pale but composed. She moved through the house like a woman executing a plan she had rehearsed 1,000 times. She gathered Violet and Rose, who woke without crying, their eyes wide and knowing. She led them to the back room and closed the door, and she stood in front of it, blocking the entrance with her body. Sam appeared at Josie's side. He did not ask what was happening. He simply stood there, his fists clenched, his eyes fixed on the front door. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped. Silence. A long, stretching silence that seemed to press against the walls of the house like a physical weight. Then a voice, low and calm, carrying through the darkness. "Mr. Turner, I know you're in there. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to offer you a deal." It was not Crane's voice. It was a voice Josie did not recognize, older and rougher, with an edge that sounded almost friendly. The door opened, and Silas stepped out onto the porch. He left the Winchester inside, leaning against the doorframe where he could reach it in a heartbeat. "I'm listening," he said. The rider emerged from the darkness, a man on a bay horse, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. He reined in at the gate and sat there, his hands visible on the saddle horn, a gesture of peace. "The name is Hollister," he said. "I work for Emmett Crane, and I'm here to tell you that he's willing to let the woman and the children go. He'll sign a release on the debt, call it settled. All he wants is the documents." Emiline stiffened behind Josie. Her hand went to the lining of her bag, to the papers sewn inside, the proof of everything Crane had done. "What documents?" Silas asked. "The ones she's carrying. The ones that would put him away for the rest of his life." He paused. "He's willing to trade. The documents for their freedom. No more running. No more fear. Just walk away." Josie looked at her mother. Emiline's face was unreadable, but her hand was still pressed against the bag, holding it close, holding it safe. "And if I refuse?" Silas said. Hollister's voice did not change. It remained calm, almost pleasant, like a man discussing the weather. Then he said, Crane has 30 men waiting on the other side of that ridge. If I don't come back with a yes, they'll be here before dawn. And they won't be asking for documents." Silas stood on the porch with his hands at his sides and his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, the posture of a man who had been in enough standoffs to know that the first move was almost never the decisive one. He looked at Hollister for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting the man's own words hang in the air between them. 30 men, he said finally. That's a lot of horses to feed for a man who's supposed to be on the run. Hollister's smile flickered but held. He's not on the run, Mr. Turner. He's collecting what's his. Silas shook his head slowly. He was not playing for time. He was reading the man in front of him, the set of his shoulders, the way he held his reins, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that betrayed a man who was repeating a script he had been given. Hollister was a messenger, not a decision-maker. He had been sent to deliver terms, and the terms had been calculated to sound reasonable while leaving no real choice. "Tell Crane I'll give him my answer at dawn," Silas said. Hollister's eyes narrowed. "That's not how this works. That's how it works tonight. You ride back and you tell him I need time to talk to the woman. These are her documents. She's the one who has to decide. I'm not going to force her hand in the middle of the night." The logic was sound, and Hollister knew it. He sat on his horse for a moment, weighing his options, and then he gave a short, curt nod. "Dawn," he said. "I'll be back at dawn. If the answer is no, you'll have company within the hour." "I understand." Hollister turned his horse and rode back into the darkness. Silas stood on the porch until the hoofbeats faded. Then he went inside and closed the door, and leaned against it for a moment with his eyes closed. When he opened them, Emiline was standing in the middle of the room with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and Josie and Sam were flanking her like soldiers taking position. "They're not going to wait until dawn," Emiline said. "No," Silas agreed, "they're not. Hollister will ride back and tell Crane I'm stalling, and Crane will move his men up within the hour. He'll surround the house and wait us out." He paused. "Unless we give him something else to chase." "What do you mean?" Silas moved to the table and spread out a map he had pulled from a drawer, a hand-drawn chart of the surrounding country with ridges and creek beds marked in faded ink. "There's a canyon about 2 miles east of here," he said. "Tight, narrow, lots of cover. If we move the children there tonight, and then send a rider north to raise the neighbors, we can set up a position that Crane can't flank. He'll have to come at us straight on, and we'll have the high ground." Emiline studied the map. Her finger traced the line of the canyon, then stopped at a point where 2 ridges converged. "How long to get the children there? An hour, maybe less. The moon is bright enough to see by. And you said the neighbors. How many can we reach tonight?" "The Harlan brothers are an hour's ride north. Caleb Pratt is closer, maybe 40 minutes. If Sam rides now, he can have them here before midnight." Sam stepped forward before Emiline could speak. "I'll go," he said. His voice was steady, but there was a light in his eyes that Josie recognized. It was the light that came on when Sam found something he could do, something that mattered. Silas looked at him. "You know the way?" "I remember what you told me. North along the canyon wall, then east to the ridge. The Harlan place has a red barn." "That's right." Silas reached into the cupboard and pulled out a small revolver, a .32 caliber, old but well-maintained. He checked the load and held it out to Sam. "You know how to use this?" Sam took it. His hand was steady. "Yes, sir. Don't use it unless you have to. Your job is to get there fast and get back with help. Don't engage anyone. Don't stop for anything. If you see riders, you circle wide and keep going." Sam nodded. He slipped the revolver into his belt and pulled his coat over it. Josie watched her brother, 9 years old, standing in the dim light with a gun at his hip and a mission in his eyes, and she felt a surge of something that was not quite pride and not quite terror. It was both, tangled together so tightly she could not separate them. "I'll be back before dawn," Sam said. He looked at Emiline, and for a moment he was just a boy again, his face young and scared beneath the surface of his composure. "Mama, I'll be back." Emiline crossed the room and knelt in front of him. She took his face in her hands and looked at him for a long moment, and then she kissed his forehead and said, "I know you will. Be careful." "I will." And then he was gone, slipping out the back door into the darkness, and the house felt emptier and colder without him. Josie stood at the window and watched him disappear into the night. She wanted to call him back, to run after him, and tell him that she should be the one to go, that she was older, that she had been the one holding them together for 3 weeks. But she knew that was not true. Sam had been holding them together too, in his own way, with his silent watchfulness and his refusal to break. And now he was doing what needed to be done, and she had to trust him. "We need to move," Silas said. He was already gathering supplies, blankets, canteens, a sack of dried meat and bread from the cupboard. "Emiline, can you carry Lily?" Emiline nodded. She had already wrapped the baby in a thick blanket and was tying a sling across her chest to carry her hands-free. Violet and Rose were awake now, sitting on the settle with their eyes wide and their mouths pressed shut. They had learned not to ask questions when the adults moved with purpose. "Violet," Silas said, his voice softer now, "I need you to take Rose's hand and follow your mother. Don't let go, no matter what. Can you do that?" Violet nodded. She reached out and took Rose's hand, and Rose held on with both of hers. "Josie, you're with me. I need you to carry the supplies and keep an eye on our back trail. If you see anything moving behind us, you tell me immediately." "Yes, sir." He looked at all of them, his eyes moving from face to face, and then he said, "We're going to make it through this. I need you to believe that." No one said anything, but they all nodded, and that was enough. They moved out the back door, across the yard, and into the open country beyond. The moon was high and bright, casting long shadows across the sagebrush, and the night air was cool and still. Silas led the way, his rifle in his hand, his eyes scanning the darkness with the methodical attention of a man who had spent years reading the land for signs of danger. Emiline followed with Lily against her chest and Violet and Rose close behind her, their small hands linked, their footsteps quiet on the dry grass. Josie brought up the rear, a sack of supplies over her shoulder, her eyes fixed on the ridge behind them, watching for any movement, any flicker of light, any sign that Crane's men had already begun to move. They covered the first mile in silence. The ground rose and fell in gentle swells, and the canyon Silas had spoken of gradually emerged from the darkness ahead, a dark gash in the earth that widened as they approached. The trail down into it was steep and narrow, loose rocks shifting under their feet, and Silas went first, picking his way with care, testing each foothold before he committed his weight. Emiline followed, her breath coming hard as she balanced the baby and guided the younger girls. Josie came last, and she could hear the loose stones skittering down the slope behind her, marking their passage in the stillness of the night. At the bottom, the canyon opened into a small amphitheater of rock, a natural bowl with walls that rose 20 feet on either side. A thin trickle of water ran along the base of the northern wall, and a cluster of junipers offered cover near the center. Silas stopped and surveyed the space with a critical eye, then nodded, satisfied. "This is it," he said. "We'll make camp here. There's cover, water, and only one way in from the direction Crane will come." He pointed to a narrow gap in the rock wall at the eastern end. "That's the approach. Anyone coming through there will be silhouetted against the sky before they reach us." Emiline lowered Lily to a flat rock and began to check her temperature, pressing her palm to the baby's forehead. The fever had dropped further, and Lily's eyes fluttered open, lucid and aware for the first time in hours. She made a small, questioning sound, and Emiline gathered her up and held her close, her shoulders shaking with relief. Josie sat down on a fallen log and let herself breathe. The adrenaline that had carried her through the past hour was beginning to fade, and she could feel the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. But she could not sleep, not yet. Not until Sam came back. Silas must have read her thoughts. He squatted down beside her and said, "He'll be all right. He's smart, and he's fast, and he knows what he's doing." "I know," she said, "but knowing and feeling are two different things." He nodded, and there was no argument in his face, only agreement. "That's the hardest lesson to learn," he said. "You can know a thing with your head and still feel it in your gut. The trick is to act on what you know, not on what you feel. How do you do that?" He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the dark canyon. "Practice," he said, "and time, and failing enough times that you figure out the difference." Josie thought about that. She thought about all the times she had acted on what she felt, the moments when fear had driven her decisions, the times when she had wanted to run and had run, even when running was the wrong thing to do. She had kept her family alive for 3 weeks, but she had also made mistakes. She had chosen the wrong direction one day and lost half a day backtracking. She had trusted a stranger at a trading post and had to flee in the night when she realized he was asking too many questions. She had learned, slowly and painfully, that feelings were unreliable guides. But she had also learned that trust was a choice. And she had chosen to trust Silas Turner. And so far, that choice had not failed her. "How long until dawn?" she asked. He looked up at the sky, measuring the positions of the stars. 4 hours, maybe less. And Sam? If he made it to the Harlan place, they'll be here within 2 hours. He paused. If he didn't make it, we'll know soon enough. The words hung in the air, and Josie felt the weight of them settle on her chest. She did not let herself follow that thought to its conclusion. She focused on her breathing, on the cool air filling her lungs, on the sound of water trickling over rock. She focused on the present, because the present was all she could control. The hours passed slowly. Emiline nursed Lily and put her back to sleep, then gathered Violet and Rose close and told them a story in a low, steady voice. A story about a rabbit who outsmarted a coyote. A story they had heard 100 times before, but never needed more than tonight. The girls listened with their eyes fixed on their mother's face, and their breathing slowly steadied, and they drifted off to sleep in her arms. Silas patrolled the perimeter, moving from shadow to shadow, always watching, always listening. He did not speak, but his presence was a constant reassurance, a bulwark against the dark. Josie sat with her back against a rock and watched him move, and she thought about the wife and daughter he had lost, the life he had left behind, the silence he had built around himself. She wondered if he had ever expected to find himself here, in a canyon in the middle of the night, protecting a family that was not his own. She wondered if he had ever expected to feel anything again. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the sky above the canyon walls, the stars fading one by one until only the brightest remained. The air grew colder for a moment, the way it always did just before sunrise, and then the first rays of light touched the lip of the canyon and began to creep down the rock face, painting the stone in shades of gold and amber. Josie stood up. Her legs were stiff, her eyes gritty with lack of sleep, but she was alert. She was listening for the sound of hoofbeats, the voices of men, the signal that Sam had returned or that Crane had come. She heard neither. Silas appeared beside her, his rifle in his hand, his face unreadable. He looked at the eastern gap, the approach he had identified, and he said, "They'll be here within the hour." "How do you know?" "Because Crane is not a patient man. He waited as long as he could. Now he'll come." Josie looked at her mother. Emiline was awake, her eyes fixed on the same gap, her hand resting on the bag that held the documents. She looked tired and scared and determined, all at once, the way she had looked every day for the past 3 weeks. "What do we do?" Josie asked. Silas did not answer. He was looking at the gap, and his posture had changed. He was no longer scanning for danger. He was focused on a single point, his eyes narrowed, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening for something. Then Josie heard it. Hoofbeats, coming from the east, from beyond the gap. But they were not the hoofbeats of a large group. They were the hoofbeats of a single horse, moving fast. Silas raised his rifle, then lowered it. A figure appeared in the gap, silhouetted against the brightening sky, and Josie's heart leaped into her throat. It was a small figure, a boy on a horse, riding low over the animal's neck, pushing it hard. Sam. He reined in at the edge of the camp and slid off the horse before it had fully stopped, his face flushed and his breath coming in gasps. He was covered in dust, and there was a cut on his cheek that had not been there when he left. But he was alive, and he was grinning. "They're coming," he said. "The Harlan brothers, Caleb Pratt, Pete Delacroix, and 4 more from the settlement. They're about 30 minutes behind me." Emiline crossed the distance and pulled him into her arms. And for a moment Sam let himself be held, let himself be a boy again, wrapped in his mother's embrace. Then he pulled back and looked at Silas. "But there's something else," he said. His voice dropped and the grin faded. Marshall Ellison is with them. She rode into the settlement last night. She's been tracking Crane for 3 days. She says she has a federal warrant and 30 deputies forming up in Pueblo, but they won't be here until noon. Silas's jaw tightened. Noon is too late. That's what she said. So she's coming ahead with the others. She wants to talk to you and Mama before Crane gets here. Emiline looked at Silas. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. Then we'd better make sure there's something left to talk about. The sun cleared the canyon wall, and the light flooded the space, chasing the shadows into the corners. Josie stood at the edge of the camp, watching the eastern gap, and she thought about Sam riding through the night, about Silas standing on the porch, facing down a man with 30 soldiers behind him, about her mother carrying the proof of a monster's crimes across 3 states in the lining of her bag. She thought about the kind of people who did those things, who kept going when every part of them wanted to stop, and she realized that she was one of them. She had been one of them all along. She did not know if they would survive the next hour. She did not know if the neighbors would arrive in time, or if Marshall Ellison's warrant would mean anything against 30 armed men. But she knew that she was standing in a canyon with her family, and that the sun was rising, and that she was not afraid. The first rider appeared at the gap. A single man on a black horse, his coat gray, his hat banded with silver. Emmett Crane had come to collect what he believed was his. He sat there for a moment, silhouetted against the sky, and then he raised his hand, and the men behind him began to move. The first rider appeared at the gap. A single man on a black horse, his coat gray, his hat banded with silver. Emmett Crane had come to collect what he believed was his. He sat there for a moment, silhouetted against the sky, and then he raised his hand, and the men behind him began to move. They came through the gap in a loose formation, not the tight cluster of an ambush, but the spread-out line of men who knew they had the numbers and wanted to be seen. Josie counted them as they emerged. 8, 10, 12, more. They kept coming until the narrow canyon floor was crowded with horsemen, their rifles angled across their saddles, their faces hard and expectant. Crane sat at the center of them, motionless, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle, his eyes fixed on the small cluster of people huddled among the junipers at the base of the rock wall. Silas did not raise his rifle. He stood with it at his side, his weight balanced, his face calm in a way that Josie knew was costing him something. Emiline stood beside him, the baby still in the sling against her chest, her hand resting on the bag that held the documents. Violet and Rose had been pressed behind a boulder at the back of the amphitheater, and Sam had moved to stand in front of them, his small frame blocking their view of the armed men. Josie stayed where she was, a few paces to Silas's left, because she had decided that if this was going to end, she would end it standing on her own feet. Crane nudged his horse forward a few steps and stopped. His voice carried across the open space, calm and almost conversational, the voice of a man who believed he had already won. "Mr. Turner, I gave you until dawn." Silas said nothing. "I see you've moved your pieces," Crane continued. "That's fine. I would have done the same in your position. But the game is over now. You're in a box canyon with no way out except through me, and I have 12 men behind me who are very good at making sure things go the way I want them to." Silas shifted his weight, a small, deliberate movement that drew Crane's eyes. "You're assuming I want to go out the way you came in," he said. "I don't." Crane's smile flickered. "Then how do you intend to leave, Mr. Turner? On wings?" "The children." The words came from Emiline, and they cut through the tension like a blade. She stepped forward, past Silas, and faced Crane directly. Her voice was steady, but Josie could hear the tremor underneath, the effort it took to keep it from breaking. "The children have nothing to do with this," Emiline said. "This is between you and me. Let them go, and I'll give you the documents. I'll go with you. I'll sign whatever you want." "Mama, no," Josie said, but Emiline held up a hand without looking back. Crane studied her with the cold, appraising look of a man evaluating a piece of property. "That's a generous offer, Mrs. Carter," he said, "but I'm afraid it's no longer sufficient. You see, the documents are only part of what I need. You've become a symbol, a woman who ran from Emmett Crane and lived to tell about it. That kind of story spreads. It gives other people ideas." Emiline's jaw tightened. "Then what do you want?" "I want you to understand that there are consequences for defying me." He looked past her, at the children huddled behind the boulder, at Sam standing in front of them with his fists clenched and his eyes blazing. "I want you to watch and remember, and know that this is what happens to people who think they can take what's mine." Silas moved. It was not a charge, not a rush. It was a single step forward, and the way he held his rifle changed, the barrel coming up just enough to catch the light. "Crane," he said, and his voice was low and hard. "You're not going to touch those children." Crane's smile returned, wider this time. "And who's going to stop me? You and your single rifle against 12 men?" The sound came from behind them, from the direction of the gap that Crane's men had just entered. It was the sound of many horses moving fast, and the jingle of tack, and the low murmur of voices. Every head turned. Crane's men shifted in their saddles, hands going to their weapons, eyes scanning the ridge above the gap. The Harlan brothers came first, their matching bay horses cresting the ridge at a dead run, their rifles already out. Behind them came Caleb Pratt, his young face set in an expression of cold fury. Behind him came Pete Delacroix, and behind him came 4 more men from the settlement. Men Josie had never seen, but would remember for the rest of her life. They fanned out along the ridge, their weapons trained on the men below, and at the center of them, riding a black horse with a federal badge pinned to her coat, was Marshal Grace Ellison. The canyon went silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift, their ears pricking forward, their feet shifting nervously. Crane's face changed. The pleasant mask cracked, and something uglier showed through. He looked at the ridge, counting, calculating, and Josie saw the moment he realized that the numbers were no longer in his favor. The men from the settlement had brought others. There were at least 15 riders on the ridge now, and more coming, their dust rising in a plume against the morning sky. Marshal Ellison did not dismount. She sat her horse at the center of the line, her badge catching the sun, her voice carrying down into the canyon with the clear, unhurried authority of a woman who had been in this exact situation more times than she could count. "Emmett Crane, you are under arrest on 6 counts of fraud, 4 counts of human trafficking, and 1 count of attempted kidnapping. I have a federal warrant signed by a judge in Pueblo, and I have 15 armed citizens who are authorized to assist me in executing it. You will instruct your men to lay down their weapons, or I will instruct these good people to treat them as hostiles." Crane sat motionless for a long moment. His eyes moved from Ellison to Silas to Emiline, and then to the children, and something flickered in them. Not fear, not surrender. Something else, something that made Josie's stomach turn cold because it looked like calculation. He said very quietly, "This isn't over." Then he raised his hand, and his men began to dismount. The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. The men on the ridge descended into the canyon, and the men below were disarmed and bound with ropes that appeared from saddlebags with practiced efficiency. Marshal Ellison directed the operation with calm, precise orders, and the settlers moved with the cooperation of people who had known each other long enough to work together without needing to speak. Josie watched from the edge of the amphitheater as Crane was pulled from his horse, his hands bound behind his back, his silver-banded hat knocked from his head and trampled into the dust. He did not resist. He stood with his back straight and his eyes forward, and he looked at no one, as if the people around him were not worth his attention. But Josie saw something that made her pulse quicken. As Crane was led past the boulder where Violet and Rose were hiding, his eyes flickered to the side, just for a fraction of a second, and he looked directly at Rose. The girl shrank back, pressing herself against the rock, and Crane's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. Then he looked away, and the moment was gone, and he was being led up the trail toward the ridge where a horse waited to carry him to Pueblo and a federal cell. Josie crossed to her mother. Emiline was standing where she had stood during the arrest, her hand still pressed against the bag of documents, her face pale and drawn. She had not moved since Crane had been taken down, and when Josie touched her arm, she flinched. "Mama," Josie said, "it's over." Emiline looked at her, and her eyes were distant, like she was still somewhere else, still standing in front of Crane, with her children behind her and no way out. "Is it?" she said. She looked at the ridge where Crane had disappeared. "Is it ever over with a man like that?" Josie did not have an answer. She stood beside her mother and watched the dust settle on the trail, and she felt the same unease that Emiline was feeling. Crane had surrendered too easily. He had not fought, had not argued, had not even tried to bargain. He had simply done as he was told, and that was not the behavior of a man who believed he was beaten. Silas appeared beside them. He was carrying his rifle in one hand and a canteen in the other, and he looked as tired as Josie felt, but there was a lightness in his step that had not been there before. "Marshal Ellison wants to talk to you," he said to Emiline. "She's up on the ridge. She says she has a few questions, and then she'll need you to come to Pueblo for the arraignment." Emiline nodded. She handed Lily to Josie without a word and began to walk toward the trail, her steps slow but steady. Josie watched her go, and she felt the weight of Lily in her arms, the familiar warmth of her baby sister's body, the steady rhythm of her breathing. The fever was gone. Lily was sleeping peacefully, her small face relaxed, her lips slightly parted. She was going to be all right. Josie sat down on the fallen log and held her sister close, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself cry. Not the loud, desperate crying of the creek bank, but the quiet, steady release of tension that had been building for weeks. She cried for her father, who had died too young. She cried for her mother, who had carried the weight of a monster's debt for 3 years and never broken. She cried for Sam, who had ridden through the night to save them, and for Violet and Rose, who had been so brave without knowing what bravery meant. And she cried for herself, for the childhood she had lost, and the woman she was becoming, for the fear and the running, and the strange, unexpected hope that had begun to grow in her chest. Sam found her there. He sat down beside her without a word and put his hand on her shoulder, and they stayed like that, 2 children who had seen too much and survived it, watching the sun climb higher over the canyon walls. Marshal Ellison stayed for 2 hours. She interviewed Emiline in a quiet corner of the amphitheater, her notebook open, her questions precise and thorough. She spoke to Sam, who answered with the same flat composure he had shown at the creek bank, and she spoke to Violet and Rose, who told her about the frog and the wagon wheel and the dandelions with the earnest detail of children who did not fully understand what had happened, but knew it was important. She did not speak to Josie until she was ready to leave. Josie was sitting on the log, watching the settlers disperse, when Ellison approached. The marshal was shorter than Josie had expected, and older, with gray streaking her temples and deep lines around her eyes. But her gaze was sharp and direct, and when she sat down on the log beside Josie, she did not waste time on pleasantries. "You're Josie," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Your mother tells me you were the one who found her shoe at the creek." Josie nodded. "That took courage," Ellison said. "Most people would have panicked. You didn't." "I didn't have time to panic," Josie said. "There was Lily and the others, and I had to think." Ellison nodded slowly. "That's a rare quality," she said. "Keeping your head when everything falls apart. It's something you can't teach. You either have it or you don't." She paused, and her eyes met Josie's. "I could use someone like you," she said. "Not now, you're too young. But in a few years, if you're interested, I could use a deputy who knows how to keep her head." Josie stared at her. She had never considered the possibility of becoming anything other than what she was, the oldest daughter of a struggling family, the keeper of her siblings, the one who held things together. The idea of a future, a choice, a direction she could choose for herself, was so foreign that it took her a moment to understand what Ellison was offering. "I'll think about it," she said. Ellison smiled, a brief, warm flicker that transformed her face. "That's all I ask," she said. She stood and buttoned her coat, and before she left she said, "Your mother is one of the bravest women I've ever met. You should know that." "I know," Josie said. The marshal nodded and walked toward her horse, and Josie watched her go, and she felt something shift inside her. A door opening, a possibility she had never imagined. The rest of the day passed in a strange, suspended calm. The settlers returned to their homes, promising to come back if needed. The Harlan brothers shook Silas's hand with gruff warmth, and Caleb Pratt clapped Sam on the shoulder and told him he rode like a man twice his age. Pete Delacroix lingered for a moment, speaking quietly to Silas, and Josie caught the words "fence" and "next week," and something that sounded like an invitation. Silas nodded, and Pete mounted his horse and rode away, and the canyon was quiet again. Emiline gathered the children and began the slow walk back to Silas's ranch. The morning sun was warm on their faces, and the dust settled under their feet, and the world felt larger and gentler than it had in weeks. Lily woke and made her small, contented sound, and Emiline laughed, a sound so unexpected that Josie stopped walking to look at her. Her mother was laughing. Actually laughing, with tears streaming down her face, and she was holding Lily against her chest and spinning in a slow circle, the baby's arms outstretched, her tiny fingers catching the light. Josie watched her mother spin, and she felt the tears start again. But they were different now. They were not tears of grief or fear. They were tears of relief, of joy, of the strange, overwhelming gratitude that came from surviving something that should have killed you. They reached the ranch in the early afternoon. The house was just as they had left it, the door standing open, the dishes still on the table. Emiline put Lily down on the bed and began to unpack the few belongings they had carried with them. Sam went to check on the horses, his natural instinct for routine reasserting itself. Violet and Rose found the dandelions in the yard and resumed their game as if nothing had happened. And Josie stood on the porch, looking out at the valley, and she felt the silence settle around her like a blanket. Silas came out and stood beside her. He did not speak, and she did not need him to. They stood together in the afternoon sun, watching the light shift across the hills, and the quiet was full and rich and healing. "Crane is in custody," Silas said finally. "He'll be tried in Pueblo. With your mother's documents and Marshal Ellison's testimony, he'll be convicted. He'll spend the rest of his life in a federal prison." Josie nodded. She knew this, but hearing it said aloud made it real. She thought about the way Crane had looked at Rose, the flicker in his eyes, the curl of his mouth. She thought about his last words, whispered so quietly that only she had heard them. "This isn't over." She turned to Silas. "He said something," she said, "when they were taking him away. He said, 'This isn't over.'" Silas's jaw tightened. He looked out at the valley, and his eyes were hard. "He's a man who needs to believe that," he said. "He needs to believe that he still has power, that he still has options. But the law has him now, and the law doesn't negotiate with men like him." Josie wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that Crane was finished, that he would never hurt anyone again, that the nightmare was over. But she had learned in the past 3 weeks that the world was not always kind, that evil did not always go away just because you wanted it to. She had learned to hold two truths at once, that she was safe and that danger could still find her. She looked at Silas, and she saw that he was holding the same two truths. He was not offering her false comfort. He was offering her honesty, and that was worth more than any reassurance he could have given. "I'm going to write to Marshal Ellison," she said, "when I'm old enough. I'm going to take her up on her offer." Silas looked at her, and his eyes softened. "I think that's a fine idea," he said. Josie smiled, the first real smile she had smiled in weeks. It felt strange on her face, unfamiliar, like a muscle she had forgotten how to use. But it felt good. They stood on the porch until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside, she could hear her mother singing to Lily, the same lullaby she had sung in the canyon. She could hear Violet and Rose arguing about the dandelions, their voices rising and falling in the easy rhythm of sisters. She could hear Sam in the barn, talking to the horses in his low, serious voice. The war was not over. The peace would take time. But standing on that porch, in the warmth of a Colorado evening, with the smell of sage and dust in the air, and the sound of her family around her, Josie felt something she had not felt in so long that she had almost forgotten what it was called. She felt at home. The days that followed were quiet and ordinary in a way that felt almost sacred. Emiline began to clean Silas's house, not because it needed it, but because she needed something to do with her hands. She scrubbed the floors and beat the rugs and washed the windows until they gleamed, and Silas watched her with an expression that was part amusement and part something deeper, something he did not name. She made meals from his sparse stores, stretching the beans and the flour and the salt pork into dinners that filled the house with the smell of cooking and the sound of conversation. The children found their routines. Sam took over the morning feeding of the horses, and Silas showed him how to check their hooves and read the signs of lameness. Violet discovered that Silas had a small collection of books, dog-eared and dusty, and she worked her way through each one with the fierce determination of a child who had learned that reading was a door to somewhere else. Rose followed Silas everywhere, asking questions about everything, her voice a constant cheerful murmur that filled the silence he had lived in for 4 years. And Josie watched. She watched her mother laugh at something Sam said at the dinner table. She watched Violet read aloud to Lily, making up the words she did not know, her voice confident and clear. She watched Silas teach Rose how to braid a rope, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he guided her small ones through the loops. She watched her family heal, one ordinary moment at a time. On the 3rd night after the arrest, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Josie found Silas on the porch. He was sitting in the same spot where she had sat with him the first night, looking out at the valley. And she sat down beside him without asking. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what you said. About knowing things with your head and feeling them in your gut." "I think I understand now." He looked at her, waiting. "I know that Crane is in jail," she said. "I know that Marshall Ellison has the documents and that he's going to be convicted. I know that we're safe. But I still feel like he's out there. I still feel like I'm running." Silas nodded. "That feeling will fade," he said. "It takes time, but it will fade. And one day you'll wake up and realize you haven't thought about him in a week, then a month, then a year. And when that happens, you'll know you're free. And until then, you keep living. You keep doing the next right thing. You keep being the person who screamed into a canyon until someone came." Josie sat with that. She looked out at the valley, at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and she felt the fear settle into something manageable. It was still there, but it no longer controlled her. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "After we leave?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "I don't know," he said. "I thought I knew before you came. I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life on this land, alone, waiting for nothing." He paused. "Now I'm not so sure." "What changed?" He looked at her, and in the dim light she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. It was hope, fragile and tentative, but unmistakably there. "You did," he said, "all of you." Inside the house, Emiline had begun to sing. The lullaby drifted through the open window, soft and sweet, and Josie leaned her head against the porch post and closed her eyes. She listened to her mother's voice, and she felt the fear recede a little more. The stars wheeled overhead. The wind carried the scent of sage. And for the first time in a long time, Josie Carter believed that everything was going to be all right. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost like a dream. The kind of dream you do not trust because you have woken up from too many good dreams into hard mornings. But the mornings kept coming, soft and golden and full of the sounds of children. And slowly, the dream began to feel real. Josie woke each day to the smell of coffee and the sound of her mother moving in the kitchen. And she would lie still for a moment, listening, cataloging the sounds of safety. The creak of the pump handle as Emiline drew water. The low murmur of Silas's voice as he spoke to the horses in the barn. The clatter of Violet and Rose's feet on the porch as they raced each other to the yard. These sounds had replaced the silence that had filled her chest for 3 weeks, and she found herself holding on to them, memorizing them, storing them away against the possibility that they might not last. Because the fear had not fully left her. It had receded, like a tide pulling back, but she knew it was still out there, waiting for a moment of weakness to roll in again. She saw it in the way Emiline checked the windows before she went to bed, her eyes scanning the dark yard for movement. She saw it in the way Sam had stopped sleeping with his back to the door, a habit he had developed on the trail and could not break. She saw it in the way Rose had begun to wake in the night, crying out for her mother without knowing why. The memory of fear lodged somewhere in her small body that her mind had already forgotten. But the days were good. They were full and ordinary and healing, and Josie held on to each one with both hands. On the morning of the 15th day, a rider appeared on the ridge. Josie saw him from the porch, a dark shape against the pale sky, moving at a steady trot down the slope toward the ranch. She felt her chest tighten, the old reflex firing before her mind could catch up, and she stood and watched with her hand shading her eyes until the rider resolved into a familiar figure, Marshal Ellison, riding alone, her black horse blowing hard from the pace she had set. Emiline came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, and stood beside Josie. Her face was composed, but Josie saw her knuckles whiten as she gripped the porch rail. Ellison reined in at the gate and dismounted with the fluid ease of a woman who had spent more hours in the saddle than on her feet. She nodded to Emiline and Josie, then looked past them at the house, where Silas had appeared in the doorway. "Good morning, Marshal," Emiline said. Ellison did not return the greeting. Her face was serious, and she carried a leather satchel that she had not brought on her previous visit. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I have news. It's about the trial." Emiline's hand tightened on the rail. "Come inside," she said. They gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared meals and stories and the slow rebuilding of their lives. Sam had come in from the barn, and Violet and Rose had been sent to the bedroom with strict instructions to stay quiet. Lily was asleep in her sling, a warm weight against Emiline's chest. Silas stood by the window, his arms crossed, his eyes on Ellison's face. "The trial has been moved up," Ellison said. "The judge in Pueblo is concerned about security. Crane has connections, and there are people who would like to see him released before he ever stands before a jury. The judge wants to get him into the courtroom and past a verdict as quickly as possible." "When?" Emiline asked. "Next week. You'll need to be in Pueblo by Tuesday to give your deposition, and the trial will begin on Wednesday." "A week?" Josie felt the time constricting around them, the bubble of safety shrinking. She looked at her mother, expecting to see fear, but Emiline's face was calm. A calm that Josie knew was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "I'll be there," Emiline said. Ellison nodded. "There's something else," she said. She opened the satchel and pulled out a folded paper, a telegram, the ink smudged from the journey. "We received word yesterday. 2 of Crane's men, the ones who escaped during the arrest, have been spotted near the Colorado-New Mexico border. They're heading this direction." The room went still. Josie could hear her own heartbeat, steady and loud in her ears. Silas stepped forward. "How close?" 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the route they're taking. They've got horses, and they're moving fast. Ellison looked at Emiline. "I think they're coming for you. For the documents. Crane may be in custody, but he's not finished. He has people on the outside who are loyal to him, and they will try to silence you before you testify." Emiline set her coffee cup down with a small, deliberate click. "Then we leave tonight," she said. "No," Silas said. Everyone turned to look at him. He was standing with his back to the window, his face half in shadow, but his voice was firm. "You can't outrun them," he said. "They know the country. They know where you're going. If you leave tonight, you'll be riding into open territory with no cover and no backup. That's what they want." "What do you suggest?" Ellison asked. "We stay. We fortify. We send word to the neighbors, the same ones who came before, and we wait for them." "That's a risk," Ellison said. "It's a calculated one." Silas moved to the table and spread out the same map he had used before, tracing the lines of the canyons and ridges. "They'll come from the south, the same direction the men were spotted. There's only one approach that gives them cover." He tapped a point on the map, a narrow canyon a mile south of the ranch. "If we post a lookout here, we'll see them coming before they reach the valley floor. And if we have men waiting on the ridges, we can cut them off before they get close." Ellison studied the map. Her finger traced the same lines, and she nodded slowly. "It could work," she said, "if we have enough people." "We have enough people," Silas said. "I'll ride to the Harlan place this afternoon. Pete Delacroix and Caleb Pratt will come. There are others who owe me favors." Emiline looked at him. Her eyes were bright and her voice was steady, but there was something in it that Josie had never heard before, a vulnerability that she had kept hidden behind walls of strength. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You don't have to keep putting yourself in danger for us." Silas met her eyes. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." The moment hung between them, fragile and charged, and Josie felt like she was intruding on something private, something that had been growing in the quiet moments of the past 2 weeks. She looked away, at the map, at the window, anywhere but at her mother and the man who had become something more than a rescuer. Ellison cleared her throat. "I'll stay," she said. "I can provide federal authority and another rifle, and I can send a telegram to Pueblo to request additional deputies, but they won't arrive before the trial. We'll have to hold the line ourselves." "We can hold it," Silas said. Emiline stood up. She shifted Lily to her other shoulder and looked at each of them in turn. Her children, Silas, the marshal. Then she said, "We have 1 week. 1 week to get to Pueblo and make sure Crane never sees the outside of a prison cell. We are not going to let him win." No one disagreed. The afternoon was spent in preparation. Silas rode out to gather the neighbors, and Emiline began packing the few possessions they would need for the journey to Pueblo, not knowing if they would return to the ranch afterward. Josie watched her mother move through the house, gathering clothes and supplies with the same methodical efficiency she had shown on the morning they left Kansas, and she saw the difference. There was no fear in Emiline's movements now. There was purpose. Sam had taken Violet and Rose into the yard to keep them occupied, and Josie could hear their voices drifting through the open window. Sam's patient explanations, Rose's endless questions, Violet's occasional correction when Sam got a detail wrong. She listened to them and felt the familiar ache of love and worry, the need to keep them safe that had driven her for so long. She found Silas in the barn, checking the loads on his Winchester, his movements precise and unhurried. He looked up when she entered and nodded once, a greeting that required no words. "Can I help?" she asked. He considered this. "You can check the cinch on the mare's saddle. She's got a tendency to shift if it's not tight enough." Josie crossed to the horse and ran her hand along the girth, checking the tension, adjusting the buckle. She had learned this from her father years ago when she was too small to reach the stirrup and he had lifted her onto the saddle himself. The memory came back sharp and clear, and she let it wash over her, the good ache of it. "You're quiet," Silas said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About what happens after. After the trial, after Crane is convicted, after we don't have to run anymore. What happens then?" Silas set the Winchester down and leaned against the stall. "That depends on what you want to happen," he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been running so long that you might not know what it feels like to stop. To choose where you want to be, instead of being forced somewhere." He paused. "Your mother and I talked, a little, about what comes next. There's no pressure, no expectation, but the offer stands. This ranch is big enough for more than one family." Josie stared at him. The words landed slowly, their meaning unfolding like a flower opening to the sun. She had not let herself imagine a future here. She had been too focused on survival, on the next hour, the next day. The idea of a permanent home, of a place that was theirs, was almost too large to hold in her mind. "Would Mama stay?" she asked. Silas's face was unreadable, but his voice was soft. "I think she might, if she felt welcome." "She does," Josie said quickly. "She does feel welcome. We all do." Silas nodded. "Then maybe that's your answer. Maybe what happens after is that you stay." Josie felt something warm spread through her chest, a feeling she did not have a name for. She finished tightening the cinch and patted the mare's neck, and she let herself imagine it. A home, a school, a future that did not involve running. "Thank you," she said. Silas picked up the Winchester and slung it over his shoulder. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We still have a trial to get through." The neighbors arrived as the sun began to set. The Harlan brothers came first, their matching bay horses blowing hard from the pace they had set. Caleb Pratt followed, his young face set in the same cold determination he had worn in the canyon. Pete Delacroix came with two men Josie did not recognize, settlers from farther down the valley who had heard what had happened and had come to help. They gathered in the yard, their voices low and serious, and Silas laid out the plan on the hood of a wagon, using a stick to trace the lines of the terrain. Marshal Ellison stood apart, her arms crossed, listening. She added details when Silas missed them, corrections when the plan needed tightening, and the men listened to her with the respect they would have given any lawman. By the time the sun had fully set, the plan was solid. Lookouts would be posted on the ridge at first light. Riders would patrol the southern approach. If Crane's men appeared, they would be met with force. Emiline served dinner to the assembled group, a stew stretched with extra water and the last of the potatoes Silas had stored. The men ate quickly, quietly, and then dispersed to their assigned positions. The yard emptied, and the house fell silent. Josie lay in bed that night with Violet and Rose asleep on either side of her, their small bodies warm and trusting against her own. She listened to the sounds of the night, the creak of the house settling, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of voices from the porch where Emiline and Silas sat talking. She could not make out the words, but the tone was enough, low and careful, and full of something that sounded like hope. She closed her eyes and let herself believe that they would make it, that Crane would be convicted, that they would stay on this ranch and build a life, that the fear would eventually fade, and all that would be left was the love. She was almost asleep when she heard it, a sound that did not belong. A single note, high and thin, carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the ridge. A horse whinnying. Not from the barn, where Silas's horses were settled for the night. From the south. She sat up, her heart pounding. The voices on the porch had stopped. She heard Silas's footsteps cross the yard, then the creak of the barn door, then silence. She waited, holding her breath. The silence stretched. The night pressed in around her, dark and full of unseen things. And then she heard Silas's voice, low and calm, carrying through the darkness. "Josie, stay inside." She obeyed. She lay back down, her hand resting on Violet's back, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She listened to the night, straining for any sound, any sign, any indication of what was out there. But the silence held, unbroken, until at last the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the sky. The morning came cold and clear. Josie rose before anyone else and went to the window, looking out at the yard. Silas was there, standing by the gate, his rifle in his hand, his eyes fixed on the southern ridge. He had not slept. She could tell from the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his posture. She pulled on her coat and went outside. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of frost and dry grass. She walked up beside him and stood without speaking. "There was a rider," he said finally, "in the night." He came to the edge of the ridge, sat there for a few minutes, and then turned back. He didn't come closer. "One of Crane's men?" "I think so. Scouting. Testing our readiness." "Are they coming?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "They're coming. But not today. They'll wait until we're on the road to Pueblo. That's when they'll move." "How do you know?" "Because that's what I would do." He looked at her, and his eyes were tired but steady. "And because Crane's men are not stupid. They know we're ready for them here. They'll wait until we're vulnerable, stretched out on the trail, with no cover and no backup." Josie felt the cold seep into her bones. "Then we change the plan," she said. "We leave tonight, before they expect it." Silas looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "That's not a bad idea," he said. "Let me talk to your mother." They left at midnight, under a moonless sky, riding in silence with the children bundled in blankets and the horses moving at a careful walk. Marshal Ellison rode at the front, her hand on her weapon, her eyes scanning the darkness. Silas brought up the rear, his Winchester across his saddle, ready to turn and fight at the first sign of pursuit. Emiline rode in the middle, with Lily in the sling, and Violet and Rose pressed against her sides. Josie rode beside Sam, their horses close enough that they could have reached out and touched each other. They traveled through the night, stopping only to rest the horses, and by dawn they had put 10 miles between themselves and the ranch. The trail to Pueblo stretched ahead of them, winding through low hills and open plains, exposed and vulnerable. But the sky was clear, and no dust rose behind them, and by midday, Josie began to believe that they might make it. She looked at her brother, riding beside her with his back straight and his eyes alert, and she remembered the boy who had ridden through the night to bring help, the boy who had faced armed men without flinching. She looked at her mother, carrying the weight of the family and the documents and the hope of a future. She looked at Silas, a man who had been alone for 4 years and had opened his home to strangers. She looked ahead, at the road that led to Pueblo, to justice, to a new beginning. And she kept riding. The sun climbed higher, and the land opened around them, wide and empty and exposed. Josie felt the vulnerability of it in her bones, the way a rider on a distant ridge could see them for miles before they ever saw him. She kept her eyes moving, scanning the horizon the way Silas had taught her, looking for anything that did not belong. A flash of light that might be sunlight on a rifle barrel. A dust plume that might be horses moving fast. The shape of a man where no man should be. The trail followed the course of a dry creek bed, winding through low hills covered in sage and cactus. The horses picked their way carefully, avoiding the loose rocks that could turn an ankle and strand them in open country. Marshal Ellison set a pace that was fast enough to cover ground, but slow enough to preserve the animals for the longer journey ahead. She did not speak unless necessary, and her silence communicated the gravity of their situation more clearly than any words could have. By mid-afternoon, they had covered nearly 20 miles. The children were flagging. Rose had begun to cry quietly, the kind of crying that came from exhaustion rather than fear, and Violet had stopped asking questions, her eyes fixed and distant. Lily had woken twice, fussy and hungry, and Emiline had fed her from the saddle, a maneuver that required the kind of balance and coordination that only a mother who had done it 100 times could manage. Sam was still alert, but Josie could see the tiredness in the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking. Silas pulled up beside Ellison and spoke in a low voice. "They need to rest. The horses need water." "There's a way station about 3 miles ahead, an old stage stop that's been abandoned for years. There's a well, and the walls are still standing. We can hold up there for a few hours, let everyone recover." Ellison considered this, her eyes scanning the horizon. "How defensible is it? It's a single building with 2 doors and 4 windows. Not ideal, but better than open ground. And the well means we don't have to risk a creek crossing where we could be ambushed." Ellison nodded. "We'll make for it." The way station appeared out of the heat shimmer like a mirage, a low structure of weathered wood and stone, its roof sagging in the middle, its windows dark and empty. The corral beside it had collapsed years ago, the poles lying scattered in the dust. But the well was still there, a stone ring with a rusted pulley and a length of rope that looked frayed but serviceable. They dismounted and led the horses to the well. Silas worked the rope while Sam lowered the bucket, and the water that came up was cool and clear, tasting of iron and earth. The horses drank deeply, and the children took turns cupping water to their mouths, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. Emiline carried Lily inside the building and found a corner that was relatively clean, swept free of debris by the wind that whistled through the gaps in the walls. She spread a blanket and laid the baby down, then sat beside her, her back against the wall, her eyes closed. For a moment she looked her age, the lines of worry and exhaustion etched into her face, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her shoulders. Josie stood in the doorway and watched her mother rest. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort or reassurance, but she knew that words were not what Emiline needed. What she needed was what they all needed: safety, an end to the running. A moment when she could let go of the burden she had carried for so long. Sam came up beside Josie. He had a canteen in his hand, and he offered it to her without a word. She took it and drank, the water cool against her dry throat. "How much farther?" he asked. "Ellison says we're about halfway. If we keep this pace, we'll reach Pueblo tomorrow evening." Sam nodded. He looked out at the open country, his eyes narrow and calculating. "They'll come tonight," he said, "if they're going to come." Josie had been thinking the same thing, but hearing Sam say it made it real. She looked at the ridges around them, the folds of the land where men could hide, and she felt the old familiar tightening in her chest. "Then we'll be ready," she said. They took turns keeping watch through the afternoon and into the evening. Silas took the first shift, standing at the window that faced south, his rifle cradled in his arms, his eyes never still. Ellison took the second shift, pacing the perimeter of the building, her hand resting on her revolver. Josie took the third shift, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon and the shadows lengthened across the valley floor. She stood at the window and watched the light change, the gold fading to orange, the orange to purple, the purple to the deep blue of twilight. She listened to the sounds of the evening, the calls of birds settling into their roosts, the rustle of small animals emerging from their burrows, the whisper of the wind through the sage. It was peaceful, in a way that felt deceptive, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She thought about her father. She had not let herself think about him much in the weeks since they had left Kansas, because thinking about him made the grief fresh, and the grief made it hard to keep moving. But standing there, watching the night descend, she let herself remember. His hands, calloused and gentle, lifting her onto a horse for the first time. His laugh, loud and unguarded, filling their small farmhouse with warmth. The way he had looked at her mother, with an admiration that had never dimmed, even in the hard years. He would have liked Silas, she thought. He would have recognized in him the same quiet strength, the same willingness to stand between danger and the people he cared about. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Emiline had come to stand beside her, her arms wrapped around herself against the cooling air. They stood together in the darkness, mother and daughter, looking out at the same vast landscape. "I'd been thinking about your father," Emiline said, as if she had read Josie's thoughts. "Me too. He would be proud of you, Josie. Of all of you." Josie felt her throat tighten. "I don't feel proud," she said. "I feel tired." "That's because you've been carrying too much." Emiline put her hand on Josie's shoulder, and the touch was warm and familiar, a comfort that Josie had not realized she needed. "But you don't have to carry it alone anymore." The words settled into Josie's chest, filling a hollow she had not known was there. She leaned into her mother's side, and for a moment she let herself be a child again, the oldest daughter, but still a daughter, still in need of her mother's strength. "I think we should stay," Josie said, "after the trial. I think we should stay at the ranch." Emiline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking the same thing." Josie looked up at her. "Really?" "Really. Silas hasn't said it in so many words, but I think he wants us to, and I think we could be happy there, all of us." Josie felt a smile spread across her face, the first real smile she had felt in days. She did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. She simply stood with her mother, watching the stars emerge, one by one, in the vast Colorado sky. They were woken before dawn by the sound of hoofbeats. Josie came awake instantly, her hand reaching for the rifle that Silas had leaned against the wall beside her bedroll. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, her heart pounding, her eyes scanning the darkness. The hoofbeats were close, coming from the east, moving fast. Silas was already at the window, his rifle raised. He stood motionless for a long moment, listening, and then his posture relaxed, just slightly. "One rider," he said, "moving hard, coming straight for us." Ellison appeared at his side. "Friend or foe? Don't know yet." They waited. The hoofbeats grew louder, and then a shape emerged from the pre-dawn gray, a horse lathered and blowing, a rider slumped over its neck. The rider pulled up at the edge of the yard and slid from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, landing hard on his knees and pushing himself upright. It was Pete Delacroix. He was covered in dust, and there was a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his shirt. His face was pale, his eyes wild, but he was alive, and he was here. "They came," he said, his voice hoarse and urgent. "Last night. They hit the ranch. We held them off, but there were more than we expected. The Harlan brothers are hit, Caleb too. I came to warn you. They know you're heading to Pueblo. They've got men on the trail ahead of you." Silas crossed to him and caught him as his knees buckled. "Easy," he said. "You're bleeding. It's not bad, a graze. But you need to hear this. Crane's men are not just coming from behind, they're ahead of you too. They've set up an ambush about 10 miles north, at the pass near Red Rock Canyon. They're expecting you to come through there at midday." Silas looked at Ellison. His face was hard, but his voice was steady. "Can we go around?" Ellison shook her head. "Not without adding 2 days to the journey. We'd have to cross the open desert, and we don't have enough water. Then we go through. They'll be waiting." "I know." Silas looked at Pete. "How many?" "At least a dozen, maybe more. They've got rifles and they've got the high ground." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then we don't go through at midday. We go through now, before they're ready." Ellison frowned. "It's still dark. We'd be riding blind. We'd be riding with the advantage of surprise. They're expecting us at midday. They'll be sleeping or eating or not paying attention. If we move now, we can be through the pass before they even know we're coming." Ellison considered this. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was worse. She nodded. "We move in 10 minutes. Emiline had already begun to wake the children, her voice low and urgent. Violet and Rose came awake with the practiced speed of children who had learned that dawn could mean danger. Lily was lifted into the sling, still asleep, her small body warm and trusting against her mother's chest. Sam checked the cinch on his horse without being told, and Josie gathered the few supplies they had spread out on the floor. They were in the saddle within 15 minutes. Pete Delacroix insisted on riding with them, despite the blood on his sleeve, and Silas did not argue. They needed every able body they could get. They rode hard, the horses pushed to a pace that could not be sustained for long, but did not need to be. The pass at Red Rock Canyon was 10 miles away, and they had to reach it before the sun cleared the eastern ridge and exposed them to the eyes of the men waiting above. The miles passed in a blur of dust and pounding hooves. Josie rode with her head low, her hand gripping the reins, her eyes fixed on Silas's back ahead of her. She did not think about what waited for them at the pass. She did not think about the rifles aimed down from the high ground. She thought only about the next stride of her horse's legs, the next breath of air in her lungs, the next moment of forward motion. The canyon appeared ahead of them, a dark gash in the red rock, its walls rising sheer on either side. The trail passed through a narrow defile, barely wide enough for 2 riders abreast, with ledges and overhangs that offered perfect cover for an ambush. Silas raised his hand and slowed his horse to a walk. He turned in the saddle and looked at them, his face grim and determined. "We go through fast and quiet," he said. "Don't stop for anything. If they start shooting, you keep moving. Don't look back. Don't slow down. The moment you're through the other side, you keep riding until you reach the tree line. Understood?" They nodded. He turned back to the pass and urged his horse forward. They entered the defile, the rock walls closing in around them, the light dimming as the sun was blocked by the towering cliffs. The only sound was the echo of hoofbeats, bouncing off the stone, magnified and distorted until it sounded like a dozen riders instead of 7. Josie's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She held her breath, listening for the crack of a rifle, the shout of a man, any sound that would announce the beginning of the attack. The defile widened ahead, opening into a small basin before narrowing again on the far side. They were halfway through, almost clear. And then she heard it. A single rifle shot, sharp and close, echoing off the walls. Then another, then a volley. The volley tore through the narrow pass like a thunderclap, the sound hammering off the rock walls, multiplying into a deafening roar that seemed to come from every direction at once. Josie's horse reared, hooves pawing the air, and she clung to the reins with both hands, her legs gripping the mare's sides with all the strength she had. Dust exploded around them, kicked up by bullets striking stone, and the sharp smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils. "Keep moving!" Silas's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Don't stop!" She urged her horse forward, crouching low over its neck, her eyes streaming from the dust. Beside her, Sam's horse stumbled as a bullet kicked up dirt at its feet, and Sam pulled hard on the reins, keeping the animal upright. Ahead, Emiline had Violet and Rose pressed against her, their faces buried in her sides, her body curved around them like a shield. Lily was screaming, a thin, terrified wail that cut through the gunfire. Another volley. This time, Josie heard the sound of a bullet striking flesh, a wet, heavy thud followed by a sharp cry. She looked back and saw Pete Delacroix lurch in his saddle, his hand flying to his shoulder, his face twisted in pain. He swayed, and for a moment she thought he was going to fall. But he caught himself, gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled fingers. Silas wheeled his horse around, firing his Winchester from the saddle, the shots precise and controlled. He was aiming at the ledges above, where muzzle flashes flickered like angry fireflies in the dim light. Josie saw one of the flashes stop, and a body tumbled from the rocks, crashing into the canyon floor with a sound that made her stomach turn. "Go!" Silas shouted, already turning back. "I'll cover you." Ellison had dismounted and was firing from behind her horse, her revolver steady, her face calm and focused. She took down another shooter on the ledge, and the gunfire from above slackened, the attackers momentarily suppressed. Josie pushed her horse forward, past the narrowest point of the defile, into the wider basin beyond. Sam was beside her, his face pale but determined, his horse blowing hard. Emiline followed, Violet and Rose still pressed against her, Lily still screaming. Pete was behind them, his horse struggling under the double weight of its rider and his wound. They were almost through. The far end of the defile was 20 yards ahead, the light growing brighter as the walls fell away. Then Josie heard the sound of a horse screaming, a terrible, high-pitched sound that ended abruptly. She looked back and saw Pete's horse stumble, its front legs buckling, a dark stain spreading across its chest. Pete was thrown forward, hitting the ground hard and rolling, coming to a stop in a cloud of dust. Silas saw it too. He was already turning his horse, riding back toward Pete, his face set in hard lines. Ellison shouted something, but Silas did not stop. He reached Pete, swung down from his saddle, and hauled the wounded man to his feet. Pete's legs would not hold him, and Silas, half carried, half dragged him to his own horse, heaving him into the saddle. Josie did not wait to see more. She pushed her horse through the final yards of the defile and burst out into the open, the sun blinding after the dimness of the canyon. She kept riding, her eyes fixed on the tree line ahead, the dark line of cottonwoods that marked the edge of a creek. She did not slow until she reached them, pulling her horse up in the shade of the largest tree, gasping for breath. One by one the others emerged from the canyon. Sam came next, his horse blowing hard, his face streaked with dust and tears he would never admit to. Emiline followed, her eyes wild, checking her children with frantic hands. Violet was crying, but she was whole. Rose was silent, her face pressed against Emiline's side, her small body trembling. Lily had stopped screaming and was now whimpering, her breath coming in ragged hiccups. Ellison came last, riding at a controlled trot, her revolver still in her hand. She scanned the ridge behind them, but there was no pursuit. The ambush had failed. They had made it through. But where was Silas? Josie's heart lurched. She turned her horse, ready to ride back into the canyon, but Ellison held up a hand. "Wait," she said. "Give him time." They waited. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity. Josie's hands were shaking, and she clenched them on the reins to steady herself. She counted her breaths. In, out, in, out. Then a figure emerged from the mouth of the canyon, riding slowly. A second figure slumped across the saddle in front of him. Silas. He was leading Pete's horse, its reins tied to his saddle, the animal limping but alive. Silas himself was unharmed, but his face was gray with exhaustion, and there was a dark bruise spreading across his cheek, where a bullet had passed close enough to leave a mark. He reached the tree line and dismounted, easing Pete down onto the grass. Pete's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. The blood on his sleeve had spread, but it had stopped flowing freely, the wound clotted with dust and pressure. Ellison knelt beside him, tearing a strip from her shirt to bind the wound. "He'll make it," she said, "but we need to get him to a doctor." "Pueblo," Silas said. "We're not far now, 4 hours, maybe 5. Josie slid from her horse and crossed to Silas. She did not know what to say, so she simply stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm, letting him know that she was there. He looked down at her, and something in his face softened. "You did well," he said. "All of you." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They rested for 15 minutes, letting the horses recover, tending to Pete's wound as best they could. Sam had a graze on his arm, a thin red line where a bullet had passed through his sleeve without breaking the skin. He insisted it was nothing, and Josie let him believe it, though her hands trembled as she checked the wound for herself. Then they mounted and rode on, slower now, the horses tired and the riders exhausted. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down on them, and the miles passed in a haze of dust and silence. Pueblo appeared on the horizon as the evening shadows began to lengthen, a cluster of buildings rising from the plain, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of life carrying across the distance. They had made it. They rode through the streets, drawing stares from the townspeople, a bedraggled procession of dust-covered riders with a wounded man slung across his horse. Ellison led them to the federal courthouse, a solid stone building at the center of town, and called for a doctor. Within the hour, Pete was in a bed with his wound cleaned and bandaged, the doctor pronouncing that he would recover with rest. The children were given a room in the boarding house across the street, a small space with 2 beds and a wash basin, and Emiline put them all to bed with a firmness that brooked no argument. Lily was asleep before her head touched the pillow, her fever a distant memory, her cheeks pink with health. Josie stood at the window of the boarding house, looking out at the darkening street. The trial would begin tomorrow. Crane would be brought into the courtroom, and her mother would stand before a judge and jurors and tell them everything. And after that, it would be over. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Silas stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face tired but peaceful. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. "I will." He nodded and turned to go, then stopped. "Josie," he said, "what you did back there, in the canyon, turning back for Sam, that took courage." She had not told him about that. She had not told anyone. When Sam's horse had stumbled and he had nearly fallen, she had reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him onto her own horse, riding double through the last of the gunfire. It had been instinct, not courage. The same instinct that had driven her for weeks. The need to keep her family together. "I couldn't let him go," she said. "I know." Silas met her eyes. "That's what courage is, Josie. Not being unafraid, refusing to let go." He left and she stood at the window, his words settling into her chest. She thought about her father, about the farm in Kansas, about the long road that had brought them here. She thought about the trial tomorrow, and the future after it. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was ready. The morning of the trial dawned clear and cold. Josie woke before the sun, dressed in the cleanest clothes they had, and went to the courthouse with her family. They were led into a small room behind the courtroom, where Emiline would wait until she was called to testify. The children sat on a bench against the wall, their hands folded, their faces solemn. Lily sat in Josie's lap, playing with a button on her dress, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Marshall Ellison came in, her badge polished, her face serious. "It's time," she said to Emiline. Emiline stood. She looked at her children, one by one, her eyes lingering on each face. Then she said, "I'll be back soon." She followed Ellison out the door, and Josie watched her go, her heart pounding. The minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second an eternity. Sam sat with his back straight, his hands on his knees, his eyes fixed on the door. Violet whispered something to Rose, and Rose whispered back, and they held hands. Lily fell asleep in Josie's lap, her breath warm and even. Then the door opened. It was not Emiline. It was a deputy, his face pale, a folded piece of paper in his hand. He looked at Josie, and his voice was tight. "Miss Carter, you need to come with me. There's been a development." Josie followed the deputy down the narrow hallway, her boots echoing on the worn wooden floor. The courthouse smelled of old paper and dust, and the faint, sharp tang of wood polish. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples, and she had to concentrate on putting one foot in front of the other, because if she stopped moving, she was afraid she might not start again. The deputy stopped at a heavy door and opened it, gesturing for her to enter. She stepped inside and found herself in a small antechamber adjacent to the courtroom. A bench ran along one wall, and a window looked out onto the street. Emiline was sitting on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. Marshall Ellison stood beside her, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Josie looked at her mother, then at the marshal. "What happened?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Ellison spoke first. "Crane tried to escape last night," she said. "He had men on the outside, guards who were paid to look the other way." But we had informants. We knew it was coming. He was apprehended before he got 50 yards from the jail. Josie felt the air leave her lungs in a long, slow exhale. Is he? He's back in his cell. The judge has been informed. The trial will proceed as scheduled, but there's been a change. The judge has decided to expedite the proceedings. He's calling the jury in now. Your mother will testify within the hour. Emiline stood up and crossed to Josie. She took her daughter's face in her hands and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made Josie's breath catch. I need you to be brave for a little while longer, she said. I need you to take your brother and sisters and wait for me. No matter what happens in that courtroom, no matter what they say or what Crane tries to do, you need to stay together and stay strong. Can you do that? Josie nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. Emiline kissed her forehead, a long, lingering kiss that felt like a blessing. Then she straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and walked through the door that led into the courtroom. The hours that followed were the longest of Josie's life. She sat in the antechamber with Sam and Violet and Rose, Lily asleep in a makeshift bed of folded coats on the floor. She listened to the muffled sounds from the courtroom, the murmur of voices, the occasional sharp crack of the gavel. She watched the light shift across the floor as the sun moved across the sky. She counted the cracks in the plaster ceiling, the knots in the wooden bench, the number of times Sam shifted his weight beside her. At noon, a bailiff brought them bread and water. Josie made the children eat, though she could not swallow a bite herself. At 1 o'clock, the door opened and Marshal Ellison appeared, her face grave. Come with me, she said. They followed her into the courtroom. It was smaller than Josie had expected, with high windows that let in the afternoon light and a gallery filled with people she did not recognize. The jurors were in their box, their faces tired but attentive. The judge sat at the bench, his robes dark and his expression severe. And at the defendant's table, flanked by 2 deputies, sat Emmett Crane. He looked different than he had in the canyon, smaller somehow. His gray coat was gone, replaced by a plain prison shirt. His silver-banded hat was absent, and his hair was disheveled. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating. They found Josie as she entered, and he smiled, a thin, malicious curl of the lips that made her stomach turn. She looked away. She found her mother in the witness box, standing tall, her hand on the railing, her voice clear and steady as she answered the prosecutor's questions. She had been testifying for hours, but she showed no sign of fatigue. She spoke with the same precision and calm she had used in the kitchen at Silas's ranch, laying out the facts of 3 years of deception, the loan, the threats, the flight, the documents sewn into her bag. The prosecutor held up a sheaf of papers. And these documents, Mrs. Carter, can you identify them for the court? Yes, Emiline said. Those are the records I kept. They show every transaction, every debt, every person whose life Emmett Crane destroyed. The prosecutor entered them into evidence. The judge examined them. The jury passed them among themselves, their faces growing grimmer with each page. When the prosecution rested, Crane's lawyer made a weak attempt at a defense, a series of objections and denials that fell flat in the face of the evidence. Crane himself did not testify. He sat at the table with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the jury's heads, refusing to acknowledge the proceedings. The judge gave his instructions to the jury. They filed out. The courtroom waited in silence. 23 minutes later, they returned. The foreman stood. His voice was steady as he read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The gavel fell. The judge pronounced the sentence, life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Crane did not react. He stood as the deputies took his arms, his face a mask of cold indifference. But as he was led past the gallery, past the bench where Josie sat with her family, he turned his head and looked at Emiline. His lips moved, forming words that only she could see. Then he was gone, through the door at the back of the courtroom, and the heavy lock clicked shut behind him. Emiline stood in the witness box, her hands gripping the railing. She did not move for a long moment. Then her knees buckled, and she sank onto the bench behind her, and she put her face in her hands and wept. Josie crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her mother. She did not speak. She simply held her, feeling the sobs that shook her mother's shoulders, the release of years of fear and tension and grief. Sam came and stood beside them, his hand on his mother's back. Violet and Rose pressed in close. Lily was still asleep in the sling, oblivious to the weight that had been lifted from them all. Slowly, the courtroom emptied. The spectators filed out. The jurors departed. The judge retreated to his chambers. Only the Carter family remained, and Marshall Ellison and Silas Turner, who had slipped in through the back door during the verdict and stood now against the wall, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on Emiline. She looked up and saw him. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood, walking toward him on unsteady legs. She stopped a foot away from him, and they looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. Then Emiline said, "We're free." Silas nodded. "You are." She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and they stood there, in the empty courtroom, holding on to each other as if they had found something they had been searching for their whole lives. They left Pueblo the next morning. The sky was clear and cold, the air sharp with the promise of winter. They rode in a wagon that Silas had borrowed from a friend, the children bundled in blankets, their belongings packed in a single trunk. Pete Delacroix had been released from the doctor's care and had insisted on riding with them as far as the ranch, his arm in a sling, his spirits high. The journey took 2 days, but it felt shorter than the ride into Pueblo. The landscape opened around them, wide and golden and peaceful, and the tension that had been coiled in Josie's chest for weeks began to ease with every mile. On the second afternoon, they crested the ridge and saw the ranch below them. The house stood in the valley, its red roof warm in the late sunlight, the corral empty, the windmill turning slowly in the breeze. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Josie realized that one of the neighbors must have been by, lighting a fire to welcome them home. Home. The word settled into her chest and took root. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and set the brake. He sat for a moment, looking at the house, and Josie saw something move across his face. Gratitude, maybe, or wonder. The expression of a man who had spent 4 years alone and had returned to find his silence filled with the sound of a family. The children spilled out of the wagon before it had fully stopped. Violet and Rose ran for the front door, their laughter ringing across the yard. Sam went straight for the barn, his natural instinct reasserting itself. Lily woke in Emiline's arms and made her small, contented sound, reaching for the light. Josie stayed in the wagon for a moment, looking at it all. The house, the yard, the hills beyond, the sky stretching wide and impossibly blue. She thought about the shoe in the creek mud, and the scream that had brought Silas down into the canyon, and the long road that had led them here. She thought about the things she had lost and the things she had found. And she knew, with a certainty as solid as the ground beneath her, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She climbed down from the wagon and walked into the house. The fire was burning in the stove, and the kettle was warm, and there was a loaf of bread on the counter that Margaret Delacroix must have left. The house was no longer silent. It was full of the sounds of children, of Violet and Rose arguing over the best spot by the fire, of Sam's boots crossing the floor, of Lily's babbling, of Emiline's voice, singing the lullaby about the river and the cottonwood tree. Silas stood in the doorway, watching them. He had not come inside yet. He stood with his back against the frame, his arms crossed, his eyes moving from face to face as if he was memorizing them. Josie crossed to him. "Are you coming in?" she asked. He looked at her, and the corners of his eyes crinkled. "In a minute," he said. "I'm just enjoying the sound." They stood together in the doorway, the warmth of the fire spilling out around them, the cold air of the evening pressing against their backs. Inside, her family was laughing. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear, one by one, in the vast Colorado sky. It had been a long road. It had been hard and cruel and full of fear. But they had come through it, not because the world had been kind, but because they had refused to stop. They had held on to each other, and to the hope that something better was waiting for them. And it had been. It had been here all along, in a valley beneath a red roof, in the heart of a man who had been alone, in the courage of a woman who had carried the truth across 3 states, in the quiet strength of children who had learned to be brave before they had learned to be anything else. Josie stepped inside and closed the door. The fire crackled, the kettle whistled. Somewhere in the yard, a horse stamped its foot, and in the warm, golden light of the kitchen, the Carter family sat down to supper together, in the home that would be theirs for as long as they wanted it. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.